Hello, hello, hello. Hope everyone's having a wonderful morning. And we got a couple of hearings this morning. So, with that being said, we will get this thing started like we start everything else, but we will actually get other things going on because there is so much going on in the world today. There really is a lot of crap going on today. So, we will get this. We will do the intro, the short intro, which I'm trying to make one about a 30-second intro. But with that, let's get this started. When you guys get back, I will have the actual hearing up here, even though it's not ready yet. But let's get this thing started.
All right, if everyone will please take their seats. Good morning and welcome to the first hearing in the Communications and Technology Subcommittee of the 119th Congress. I am honored to serve as the chairman of this subcommittee, where there's a rich history of identifying and addressing the most pressing issues raised in the communications and technology sectors. As technology continues to advance, this subcommittee will be at the forefront of solving tough issues. The subcommittee has historically worked in a bipartisan manner to solve many of the issues before us, and I plan to continue that tradition by working with my ranking member, Representative Matsui, who I respect very much and have admired her work and accomplishments as a leader in this space, and look forward to working together and learning from Ms. Matsui. I'm grateful for the work Chairman Latta brought to this subcommittee, and I'm looking forward to continuing it and learning from him as well. I'm also excited to work with my vice chairman, Mr. Rick Allen, and all of my colleagues on this subcommittee on both sides of the aisle to advance important legislation in this Congress. Our nation is the world's economic powerhouse, and we lead the world in innovation. America is home to the best technology companies, both large and small. These companies lead in everything from next generation wireless technology to all the emerging technologies that rely on connectivity, ranging from artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things to next-gen 911 and precision agriculture. Our country's startup ecosystem is strong and should be fostered. This committee must advance thoughtful policy that continues to grow American innovation and productivity rather than stifle it. Next-generation wireless technology supports many of these technological advancements. It impacts nearly every sector of our economy, from powering everyday communications networks and advancements in healthcare and manufacturing to being used for our national defense, something heavily present in my district at Fort Bragg. We call it the epicenter of the universe. It's the home of our special forces and the largest Army base in the world. But if our wireless networks are going to keep pace with the speed of innovation, we need to make sure they have additional spectrum resources. Spectrum is a crucial element for wireless technology to operate. Americans depend on connected devices in their everyday lives, and the congestion on our networks has skyrocketed. Our wireless networks need to keep up. As our wireless networks advance from 5G to 6G technology and beyond, the demand for spectrum will only continue to grow. We must remember these important resources are finite. Managing these limited resources is vital to maintaining our economic dominance and protecting our national security. We will take a balanced approach to making both licensed and unlicensed spectrum available. This includes working with our federal partners, such as the Department of Defense, which must have enough spectrum to defend the homeland, but also be held accountable to use their resources efficiently. Last Congress, the Federal Communications Commission's spectrum auction authority expired for the first time due to disagreements about how spectrum resources should be allocated. These auctions have historically brought in billions to our national economy, with the highest spectrum auctions raising over $80 billion from private companies. It is simple economics. There's limited supply, unlimited demand, and a willingness to pay. We need to reauthorize the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority immediately. We must also continue looking for ways to make unlicensed spectrum available. Unlicensed spectrum unlocks the Internet of Things and smart device economy on which Americans rely, providing tremendous economic growth. Under the first Trump administration, more than 1,200 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum was made available in the 6 gigahertz band, leading to massive opportunities for innovation for our farmers, industrialists, and communities. These successes are just a start. However, as we progress, our adversaries are constantly trying to undermine our leadership in international standard setting bodies through IP theft and through cyber attacks. The U.S. must remain resolute in defending our leadership to safeguard democratic values. And this happens by trusting in our private sector partners to address some of our nation's most pressing challenges. We recently learned about Salt Typhoon, which may be the largest Chinese-backed telecommunications hack in our nation's history. As we deploy advanced networks and connected devices in an environment of great power competition, we have to thoughtfully secure our networks every step of the way. At the end of last year, I was glad to see Congress fund the removal of the remaining Chinese equipment in our communications networks. China is producing cheap communications equipment at the cost of our national security, and that needs to change. We need trusted alternatives. Companies are working to develop and deploy Open RAN technology, which is intended to promote an ecosystem of trusted vendors for communication network equipment, and I look forward to hearing an update on its progress today. The key to our success is working together with our stakeholders to deploy and secure our networks. As our adversaries seek to undermine U.S. leadership, we will continue to build a comprehensive spectrum policy in the United States and a unified position on the international stage. I look forward to discussing these issues more in depth with our witnesses today and discussing the future spectrum policy in the United States. I now recognize our ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to congratulate you on serving as the new Communications and Technology Subcommittee Chair. I look forward to working with you this Congress. I'm glad that we're starting with such a timely issue on which we have a strong bipartisan track record. The last time this subcommittee had a spectrum hearing, the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority had just lapsed for the first time in history. Now, nearly 2 years later, the FCC is still deprived of this critical tool to unlock the full potential of the spectrum airwaves, leaving U.S. economic and national security at risk. Spectrum is a key engine of wireless innovation. It supports a wide range of technologies, from remote surgery to autonomous vehicles and broadband. Our consumers, businesses, and federal agencies all stand to benefit when we maximize our spectrum use. This requires a comprehensive approach that strikes the right balance of licensed, unlicensed, and shared spectrum. We need a bipartisan solution that not only restores auction authority, but also promotes a healthy spectrum pipeline and ensures our federal government speaks with one voice on spectrum policy. And we need to be forward-looking by promoting technologies that will improve spectrum sharing and efficiency. Equally critical is our obligation to be responsible stewards of spectrum auction revenues. As a longtime advocate for the FCC's Rip and Replace program, I'm proud of our work to use spectrum auction proceeds to remove unsecured Chinese equipment from our communications networks. Spectrum is a public good, and I'm dismayed to see prospects floated that would use auction proceeds to provide tax cuts for the wealthy through reconciliation. Rather, we need to work as a subcommittee to use these funds to close the digital divide, protect national security, and support public safety communications. This includes expanding access to life-saving technologies, such as next-generation 911, for faster and more accurate emergency responses. Last Congress, this committee unanimously passed the Spectrum Auction Reauthorization Act, comprehensive spectrum legislation that would have accomplished these very goals. Disappointingly, the House Republican leadership never brought this bipartisan proposal to the floor for a vote. This Congress, we must build on our good work. I hope my colleagues will continue our history of bipartisan cooperation on spectrum. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the important work of the National Spectrum Strategy. Even amidst an auction authority lapse, the Biden administration answered my call for a unified spectrum plan by launching the first comprehensive U.S. spectrum strategy in 6 years. This strategy offers a roadmap for securing U.S. leadership in spectrum innovation and ensuring that the federal government speaks with one voice. We can't afford to throw that progress away and return to the disarray that preceded the National Spectrum Strategy. The U.S. needs a unified spectrum position now, more than ever, to fight for our interest in international negotiations and to rally other countries to our vision. If we fail to maintain our global leadership on spectrum, we create a vacuum that China will happily fill. The stakes are high. It is time for all stakeholders to come to the table and for Congress to pass comprehensive spectrum legislation that has substantial bipartisan buy-in. Clearly, there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm hopeful. This subcommittee has a proven track record of bipartisan cooperation that keeps America at the forefront of global innovation. Now is not the time to throw that aside. We have a chance to continue our tradition of working across the aisle, and I'm committed to advancing solutions that secure economic growth, national security, and bipartisan funding priorities benefiting the American public. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us today, and I look forward to the discussion. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the reminder of my time.
I thank the ranking member for her remarks, and I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing us together for this important hearing. And I thank you to the witnesses for your participation. I look forward to the work we will do this Congress to close the digital divide, protect our critical infrastructure, and ensure Americans are prepared to outcompete the Chinese Communist Party. I've long been an advocate for spectrum policy that serves both our national security and American innovation. I've served for many years as the co-chair with my good friend from California, Ms. Matsui. I always enjoy working with you and look forward to continue working with you as we move forward this Congress. The United States needs a spectrum agenda that enables both big and small American companies to innovate and remain competitive globally. Ensuring that the U.S. continues to be a leader in next generation wireless communications technology will create jobs and unlock new opportunities here at home as reliable, high-speed connectivity supports a range of cutting-edge applications like artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing. We cannot and we will not allow our adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party to dominate 21st century technological battle. As a first step, we must reauthorize the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority. Second, we must work together with federal agencies and stakeholders to reallocate unused spectrum. And third, we need to look at innovative tools to better utilize and manage spectrum resources. I'm looking forward to keeping our promises to Americans across the country that America is open for business, and I eagerly anticipate bold leadership across many industries, ushering in the next great American century. I will now yield to our Vice Subcommittee Chair, my good friend, Vice Chair Allen, for a few opening remarks. I will yield my time to the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie, for yielding, and Chairman Hudson, thank you for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to working with you. I'm looking forward to working with this committee and this Congress to tackle the issues, the critical issues, closing the digital divide, fighting robocalls, and strengthening our telecommunications infrastructure. Access to telecommunications isn't just a luxury. It's something Americans depend on every single day. Students need it to finish their homework. Folks of all ages, especially in rural communities, rely on it for telehealth visits with their doctors, and small businesses use it to reach customers and keep the doors open. And let's not forget, we all use it to stay in touch with friends and loved ones. Additionally, when natural disasters strike, access to reliable communications becomes even more critical. Georgia's 12th district saw firsthand just how devastating this can be when Hurricane Helene wreaked havoc in our communities last September. That storm caused significant damage to our communications infrastructure, leaving our residents unable to call for help, check in with family to let them know where they were and that they were safe, and in many cases made it impossible to receive helpful updates about accessible resources. Thankfully, we had satellite and other resilient emergency systems in place to help fill the gap with recovery efforts, and that got underway. Spectrum is absolutely vital for the wireless services and devices we use today and for the technologies of tomorrow. If we want to maintain our leadership in the world and keep pace with China's advancements, we need to free up more spectrum for both licensed and unlicensed uses. Technologies like precision agriculture, advanced manufacturing, and next-gen wireless services all depend on it. Again, I look forward to tackling these issues as Vice Chairman of the C&T Subcommittee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we're here today to discuss spectrum, one of our nation's most underrated and economically valuable natural resources. Discussion of current spectrum policy debates is important to better understand how our decisions impact America's standing in the world. But we can't ignore that this hearing comes at a time when House Republicans are considering using spectrum auction proceeds as a piggy bank to fund their costly tax breaks for billionaires and large wealthy corporations. And I hope they reconsider going down that road, because it would be a sharp departure from the way spectrum policy and auction proceeds have been handled by Congress in the past. Spectrum is such a valuable natural resource because it's an essential building block for connecting family and friends, as well as delivering critical services like education and health to people across the country. It's also critical to everyday safety for first responders. Without spectrum, we would not have radio stations, smartphones, the app economy, or drones. And many of these technological advancements were developed by American innovators, pushing the limits on the way spectrum could be used in new and exciting ways. But past performance does not guarantee future results, so America must remain a leader in spectrum policy. For more than 3 decades, Congress has granted the FCC the authority to make spectrum available using competitive bidding or auctions. And granting the FCC this authority has served both the public and the nation well. Today, the United States is a global leader in delivering 5G, advanced Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other next-generation wireless technologies to consumers across the country. At the same time, spectrum auctions, which have raised over $230 billion to the federal government, have helped fund important public communication priorities, including the Rip and Replace reimbursement program, the construction of FirstNet, and broadband infrastructure grants. And that's why spectrum policy has long been an area of bipartisan agreement. In fact, we've worked closely with the Republicans on this committee for the past 3 years on bills to extend the FCC's auction authority and use spectrum proceeds to pay for bipartisan spending priorities. And one of the areas of bipartisan agreement was the need to fund Next Generation 911. This funding would modernize our 911 networks to allow the public to use modern-day communication tools like sending texts, images, and videos to first responders and emergency personnel. And this technology will reduce response times and equip first responders with life-saving information before they arrive at the scene, which will better assist people in their critical time of need. The recent devastating wildfires in California are another reminder of how vital seconds can be in an emergency. This program clearly serves the public interest, and proceeds from auction of a public airwaves are ideal to fund it. Unfortunately, again, it seems that Republicans are now going to abandon this bipartisan work in order to march ahead to give tax breaks to the rich. And this is simply not the way these funds should be used. The auction of public airwaves should fund programs for the public good. Republicans should keep that in mind and reject proposals that would include spectrum in any reconciliation. Instead, they should work with us to set good spectrum policy and to use auction proceeds to fund vital programs that actually serve the public and not the wealthy few. And I don't think the stakes could be any higher. Failure to replenish the commercial spectrum pipeline risks our nation falling behind our counterparts across the globe, of course, particularly China, because we want to produce cutting-edge consumer innovations and enhance our national security capabilities. And we can't allow that to happen. And that's why, we can't allow to not have spectrum used for these good policy and public purposes. And that's why we should be working together. We should also work to ensure the advancements made possible by spectrum are delivered to all Americans, regardless of their income or zip code. Too often, rural, tribal, and low-income areas are left behind as next-generation technologies are deployed, and have to continue to work on making these services more affordable to everyone. So finally, I want to say, if I could take a minute, Mr. Chairman, I want to bid farewell to Jennifer Epperson, who is our Chief Counsel on the subcommittee. She's leaving the committee after 6 years of service. And during that time, she's played an instrumental role in the historic broadband investments we made in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the creation of the Affordable Connectivity Program, and our bipartisan Rip and Replace legislation that I mentioned. And we've accomplished a lot in the subcommittee, much of it bipartisan. And throughout her time, I want to thank Jennifer for helping to make that happen. So wish her nothing but the best. Of course, I don't want her to leave, but that's the way it goes. And I want to thank Jennifer for all her contributions. Thank you. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you so much.
I thank the ranking member, and I join him in thanking Ms. Epperson for your service on the committee, and wish you all the best in the future. We've now concluded our member opening statements. The chair reminds members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We would like to thank our witnesses for being here today to testify before the subcommittee. Our witnesses will have 5 minutes each to provide an opening statement, which will be followed by a round of questions from members. The witnesses here before us today are the Honorable Michael Powell, who is the President and CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Thank you for being here. Mr. Brad Gillen, the Executive Vice President of CTIA. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Diane Ronaldo, the Executive Director of Open RAN Policy Coalition. Thank you for being here. Chair would also like to recognize Cole Peterman, a special guest joining us in the audience, Ms. Ronaldo's son. Welcome, Cole. And finally, Mr. Chris Lewis, the President and CEO of Public Knowledge. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to note for our witnesses that the timer light on the table will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining and will turn red when your time has expired. And then I'll start tapping up here and then eventually banging, but hopefully we won't get to that point. Thank you. Mr. Powell, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Chairman Hudson, Ranking Member Matsui, Chairman Guthrie, and Mr. Pallone, and other distinguished members of this committee. I am Michael Powell, President and CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm going to discuss 2 topics central to America's leadership in wireless technology: Wi-Fi and shared spectrum, which is an innovative way to get more spectrum more quickly to more users. Wi-Fi has become the backbone of America's internet experience. It powers our homes, workplaces, schools, and public spaces, enabling nearly all modern digital interactions. Wi-Fi allows multiple users to share a single connection and has democratized access to the internet, making connectivity more affordable and widely available. Wi-Fi also drives innovation. By offering open, unlicensed access, it enables entrepreneurs to create smart devices and technologies, from thermostats to virtual reality. Today, the average US home has 17 connected devices and is projected to have 24 by 2027. Moreover, Wi-Fi supports critical technologies like the Internet of Things, generating $2.4 trillion in annual economic value. The U.S. has led in Wi-Fi innovation, creating systems that enable universal access without heavy regulation. However, to sustain this leadership, we must ensure enough spectrum for Wi-Fi's continued growth, particularly as demand surges with emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and virtual reality. Wi-Fi effectively is the internet. It carries nearly 60% of all the world's data traffic. It carries 10 times more data than all other wireless networks combined. And when using our smartphones, 80 to 90% of our data goes over Wi-Fi and not the cellular network. And the best part is that Wi-Fi is an American-led innovation. Wi-Fi allows innovators to make devices that connect to the internet for free and without a license from the government. We in America harness the power of our citizens to publish, to produce, and to invent. This contrasts starkly with China, who prefers to spy on its citizens rather than empower them. Wi-Fi brought us the future, and it will carry us into the AI intelligence age. American spectrum policy should embrace our leadership and continue to furnish Wi-Fi with the spectrum it needs to continue its explosive growth and meet consumers' high expectations. Now, it goes without saying, America has a spectrum problem. Put simply, demand for it is shooting up and supply of it is falling. Nearly all mid-band spectrum that we all want to use is used by critical mission government systems, most of it in the hands of our warfighters. Traditional approaches, clearing government-held spectrum for auctions, are increasingly unsustainable. We can't compromise our combat capability in the face of a dangerous world. There are fewer places to move these critical systems, and moving them is costly and time-consuming. For example, just clearing the lower 30 gigahertz band for exclusive use would take 20 years and cost $120 billion. We need a better way out of this problem. Shared spectrum is the solution. Advances in dynamic spectrum management allow government and commercial users to coexist, resolving conflicts and reducing delays. The success of Citizens Band Radio Service, CBRS, proves this approach works. It supports a diverse range of users, including schools, factories, and even disaster recovery efforts, while fostering competition and innovation. To maintain U.S. leadership, we must prioritize coexistence in shared spectrum models. Congress should extend the FCC's auction authority while embracing both shared license auctions and unlicensed Wi-Fi designations. This includes allocating more spectrum for Wi-Fi and exploring shared models in critical mid-band ranges like the 3 gigahertz and 7 gigahertz bands. By adopting forward-looking spectrum policies, we can accelerate deployment of technologies like 5G, 6G, Wi-Fi 7, and 8, strengthen national security, and sustain our global wireless leadership and our innovation. This committee has always embraced innovation, and we are on the cusp of a great innovation revolution, and we need an innovative spectrum policy to meet the moment. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you. Mr. Gillen, you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you. Congratulations, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Matsui, members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to be with
Is
you.
your microphone on? I want to make sure.
It's a privilege to be with you. A privilege to be here on behalf of the wireless industry. 4.5 million jobs strong across this country. We invest $30 billion a year to make this and so much more better. And I really want to echo your opening comments. This is a conversation around spectrum, but it's a lot more than that. It's about economic opportunity for all. It's about our national security. It's about our global competitiveness. And really comes back to connectivity drives so much of this conversation, particularly 5G connectivity. And spectrum at its core is our oxygen. I was here 2 years ago asking for more spectrum. I'm back today, and that ask is more urgent because we've stood still as a country the last 2 years. The rest of the world is moving forward aggressively, and so too are American consumers who use more and more of this each and every day, and we want to make sure we continue to meet that demand. Now, our screens today aren't 5G enabled, so we're going old school with pictures, but it's easier to explain through pictures. So if you think about how much traffic has been on wireless networks the last few years, this is where we've been. When I was here last time, we were in the orange. I actually bragged about just how much traffic was being carried on these 5G networks. We're now just 2 years later here, 100 trillion megabits of traffic on these networks, almost doubling in only 2 years of time. I think the economists call that kind of growth bananas. We just don't see that kind of growth. And we were able to do that only thanks to the leadership of this committee. It was the auctions that you directed in 2020 and 2021 that gave us the oxygen, the spectrum to actually meet that moment. So when you look forward to the next couple of years, by the end of the decade, we're going to have almost 3 times more traffic on our networks than we do today. And the challenge we face right now is we don't have new auctions right now. The FCC doesn't have auction authority to meet that moment. So how do you actually meet that consumer demand? And part of it is our responsibility. We need to invest, and we do, each and every year, $20 or $30 billion to make our networks denser, to have more facilities throughout the country. We have 40% more than we did a generation ago. We also, all of us, need to be more efficient with this finite resource. And we're very proud of our record to doing that. We're 42 times more efficient with the technology we use on a per megahertz basis than we were a generation ago. All of that is necessary, but it's not sufficient. If you plug that all in the traffic models, it reveals that we need roughly 400 more megahertz of spectrum by 2027 and over 800 by 2029. Where does that spectrum come from? The federal government today reserves roughly 2/3 of this asset, the mid-band spectrum we're talking a lot about today, for their own use. So if you look at the slide in terms of who has mid-band right today, the federal government has 600% more than we do today. We're in the teal on the bottom, 450 megahertz. Unlicensed Wi-Fi has 300% more than we do, thanks to the 6 gigahertz decision that you alluded to. What's happening in the rest of the world? They see the same type of growth curve that we see, and they're getting access to spectrum more quickly. Nowhere is that more true than with respect to China. 2023, we were roughly even with China in terms of mid-band access. Looking forward now to where we'll be in 2027, they'll be in a position to have 4 times more than us. That's untenable from a global competitive standpoint. So what do we need? We would love this committee's help. Over the last 30 years, the committee on a bipartisan basis has provided FCC auction authority, and each time you do that, you provide a plan, a roadmap of what you expect them to do with that authority, and that's critical. And now this conversation gets very jargony fast. I am extremely guilty of that. But at its core, what this conversation is about, why we really care about spectrum, why we're excited about what wireless can be, is because we have a role to play in almost everything you came to Washington to work on. Everyday household costs, we can help. Beating China, creating jobs. A new study just released this morning from NERA said for every 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum released for 5G, creates 1.5 million jobs rippling throughout the economy, both those building those networks all across the country, but also those innovating on top of that. And we also just want to close with, there's a huge role here for the digital divide and the role of spectrum to play, both connecting Americans on the mobile and the home broadband side. This is too important technology for not everyone to be involved. So we want to partner with you to make sure that this resource is available to all Americans, that everyone has a fair shot at this. Greatly appreciate you including us. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Ronaldo, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Hudson, Ranking Member Matsui, and esteemed members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on America's leadership in wireless innovation. This hearing and topic are vital to the national and economic security importance to the United States, and I welcome the committee's interest in this subject. And also thank you for recognizing my 10-year-old son, Cole. He is a budding telecom engineer. We take workforce development very serious at the coalition. So I've had the distinct pleasure of serving this body in a couple of different capacities. I was the lead cybersecurity and tech telecom staffer at the House Intelligence Committee. I was also the acting administrator of NTIA in the executive branch. Today, I serve as the executive director of the Open RAN Policy Coalition, a coalition that promotes to drive the adoption of open and interoperable solutions in the radio access network. Our coalition represents a diverse group of communication and technology companies unified under a common goal, policy that can help dismantle technological and market barriers to cultivate competitive, secure, and resilient marketplace. Since the launch of the Open RAN Policy Coalition, ORAN has experienced tremendous growth with more than 100 global deployments. From the world's largest right here in the United States with 100% Open RAN 5G network that Dish's Boost Mobile has deployed nationwide, Open RAN has achieved its initial goal of providing additional vendor choice for mobile operators. This Congress and the new administration assume office at a pivotal time in the wireless communication space. The next 2 to 4 years are critical to ensuring our country's continued leadership and competitiveness in the global contest with the People's Republic of China. Beijing's efforts to dominate the wireless space are simultaneously wide-ranging, prolific, and focused. The PRC seeks to supplant the United States as the world's leader in wireless innovation and market leadership. This is not about free market competition, but about state-sponsored market manipulation. Put simply, the PRC does not want to compete, it wants to rig the game to win. Throughout my testimony today, I will return to 3 critical themes. First is the pivotal role of US in pioneering wireless innovation. The second is the necessity of leadership in spectrum policy. And lastly is the importance of public-private policies. We truly do need to work together. The United States has had a proud legacy of leadership in wireless technology, from the groundbreaking development of 4 and 5G networks to the creation of global positioning systems, an innovation that transferred global navigation and timing. Our country has consistently been at the forefront of wireless advancements. These technologies have driven economic growth and job creation, contributing billions of dollars annually to our economy. Industries such as healthcare, transportation, and manufacturing have been revolutionized by wireless innovation, enabling new applications for remote surgery, autonomous vehicles, and smart factories. For example, estimates indicate that 5G alone will create millions of jobs and contribute over $1.5 trillion to global GDP by 2035. Looking ahead, the opportunities are boundless. However, achieving these advancements depend on one critical factor: secure and efficient access to spectrum. Now, the PRC's ascendancy is by no means destined for success. The strengths of America remain and have the potential to grow, provided they are carefully steward, encouraged, and indeed unleashed. It is Silicon Valley, not Shenzhen, to which innovators and industry flock. How can Congress and the federal government help maintain this edge? By fostering an environment conducive to innovation, removing roadblocks for growth, and aligning policies to facilitate the expansion. One fundamental element underpins all our aims, and that is spectrum leadership. Spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless communications, driving innovation and economic growth and national security. In closing, the United States is at a pivotal moment. We are the world's leader in wireless innovation, but maintaining this position requires sustained effort, investment, and collaboration. By prioritizing superiority and optimizing spectrum, strengthening partnerships, and enhancing our participation in global forums, we can assure that American innovations continues to define future connectivity. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Matsui, I appreciate you inviting me here today representing public knowledge on a topic that I agree is jargony, but wonderfully nerdy, and public knowledge that is always a compliment. So thank you. Over the last 30 years, the United States has led the world in wireless technology, and this leadership is in no small measure due to the innovative and balanced spectrum policies that have carried out on a bipartisan basis over these decades. I will highlight 3 key factors from my written testimony that have led to the success, and then I look forward to the discussion. First, our system is managed spectrum, the public airwaves, as a public asset and in the public interest, all while encouraging private investment and innovation. Other governments effectively nationalize their spectrum. Only the government could operate broadcast radio or authorize new uses of spectrum. These governments acted through ministries under the direct control of the country's chief executive. The United States, we went a different way. We created an independent agency to oversee spectrum use, designed to strike the right balance between the many users of spectrum, such as public safety, local governments, broadcasters, to encourage innovation and private investment. Most importantly, Congress recognized that spectrum represents a unique, non-renewable public resource. Congress enshrined in the Communications Act that the FCC manage the public airwaves for the public interest. This means that no one can own the public airwaves. Policy on licensees are balanced with public needs and come with public interest obligations, and that spectrum policy, including auction design and proceeds, should make efficient use of the spectrum allocations and benefit the needs of the public under the FCC mandate to connect all Americans. Today's public needs to connect all Americans include deploying next-gen 911, supporting infrastructure needs, and especially supporting digital inclusion funding needs in local communities. Local digital inclusion efforts actually lower the cost of deployment for broadband providers while giving communities, large and small, the support to realize the full potential of those infrastructure deployments. Second, the FCC has, with congressional authority, experimented with new regulatory models to create competitive opportunities in the market and foster innovation. There is no greater example of regulatory innovation than the success of Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi technology was invented in the 1980s when the FCC opened unlicensed spectrum for experimentation by engineers and inventors. These unlicensed spectrum bands allow anyone to use any device for any purpose under rules authorized by the FCC to avoid interference with licensed services. Wi-Fi carries 53% of all internet traffic and almost 90% of wireless internet traffic. Without supporting Wi-Fi and unlicensed spectrum innovation, we would not have the mobile communications revolution we now enjoy. In this century, newer regulatory models for spectrum access, like CBRS sharing models, are increasing access for small community institutions, rural and tribal communities, and other private industry outside of the big wireless carriers. Third and finally, Congress has carefully divided spectrum between federal and non-federal users at NTIA and the FCC, respectively, requiring cooperation between agencies and between federal and non-federal users. The public may not follow the day-to-day operation of NTIA and the FCC, but they do put their trust in government to make sure this resource and the technologies that use it work efficiently. Thankfully, NTIA and FCC have worked to develop more than one MOU to support cooperation between agencies and therefore processes to balance federal and commercial use needs. Without this coordination, we would return to chaos and governmental infighting. If America is going to continue its leadership in wireless technologies, we must continue to follow these proven principles that led to our success to date. Congress can lead in this direction by permanently restoring auction authority at the FCC. This is critical for enabling effective coordination between federal and commercial users, driving efficient use of the public airwaves, and delivering public interest benefits that connect all Americans to secure, reliable, and affordable communications. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We will now begin questioning, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Listen, economic security is national security, and to lead in technology as a nation, I believe we need a balanced spectrum policy that benefits both licensed and unlicensed use of spectrum. Making licensed spectrum available is more difficult, but I don't think we should resort to making everything unlicensed just because of the challenges associated with it. Mr. Powell, recognizing that your companies primarily utilize unlicensed spectrum, would you talk a little bit about what advancements in technology happening in your industry that might increase the demand for unlicensed spectrum?
The question, it's interesting to note that the cable industry pursued the convergence that we all dreamed of in the 96 Act. It uses all forms of spectrum to compete. It uses Wi-Fi, it uses shared licensed spectrum, and we also use exclusive licensed spectrum, which has allowed us to become the fourth most significant mobile service provider in the country offering competition. So we believe that going forward, you have to be creative in using all forms of spectrum allocation in order to be effective. And we look forward, we see a continuing conflict with what's available for the market to use quickly and the processes we are using to allocate that spectrum, which is why we're committed to advancing and advocating shared spectrum models. Those models now use very sophisticated dynamic spectrum technology in order to coordinate and manage among uses and competing uses, and it works quite effectively.
Thank you. Artificial intelligence has been a topic receiving a lot of attention recently because it is revolutionizing so many of our industries. As a result, it's also putting significant demand on our nation's resources. Mr. Gillen, does artificial intelligence require more bandwidth? And if so, will it need to be licensed spectrum?
We're going to need more bandwidth, period. When you think about what AI promises, it really is a good frame for this entire conversation, the ability of AI to help all sectors, much like 5G can help all sectors, but they really need to work together. When you think about the Vodafone CEO in Europe talks about the risk in Europe of AI bottleneck because there's not enough cellular capacity to meet the data needs of AI. So absolutely, when you talk about the growth curves we're talking about, AI growth, we need to make sure our networks are strong enough to carry that, to drive that innovation. We want that innovation to happen here, and that innovation is going to happen globally. Who has the best networks? That's always been us, and we're in a great place on Wi-Fi to continue to be the best. We need to do the same in 5G as well.
Thank you. Congress and the White House need to take a leadership role in repurposing federal spectrum for commercial use. Access to spectrum by federal and commercial users is necessary to protect our national security, but federal agencies are not actively looking for ways to be more efficient with their spectrum. Ms. Rinaldo, as a former active administrator of NTIA and in your current role, you were responsible for managing spectrum used by federal agencies, while also looking for opportunities to repurpose spectrum for commercial use. What are the biggest challenges presented by agencies when trying to make spectrum available?
Thank you, sir. Yes, so I was, as an example, when I was at NTIA in August of 2019, I sent a memo to all of the federal agencies asking them to do an assessment of their spectrum needs. And just today in 2025, are those bands finally being studied? So I would say it is just time. We need to make decisions a lot sooner in order to deploy.
Thank you. I'll pose this question to everybody, so we'll go down the line. But how does spectrum policy disputes domestically affect America's leadership on the global stage? And let's go in reverse order. Mr. Lewis, start with you.
I'm sorry, how does spectrum policy what?
So the disputes that we have here domestically, how does that impact our leadership on the global stage?
You know, I think history has proven that when we chart a path that promotes innovation and promotes meeting a variety of needs with our spectrum policies, that the world follows us. And so uh, debate might be good, but I think disputes that frees us picking a direction that continues to promote those values in our balanced spectrum policy can hold up our opportunity for leadership as we look at the next generation of wireless technologies like Wi-Fi 7 and 6G.
Thank you. I'm about to run out of time here, but
He's absolutely right. Debate has a time and purpose, but we need to be decisive when we go into standards bodies. We need to speak with one voice.
thank you. Well, my time has expired. Mr. Gill and Mr. Powell, if y'all want to submit something,
I just think our adversaries are unified. Their government, military, and industry are all working together. We need to be two to compete.
good point. All right. Thank you all.
Conflict equals delay.
Thank you. My time has expired and I can't hold my committee members accountable if I don't hold myself accountable. So I will stop. And at this point, I'll recognize Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the Biden administration's national spectrum strategy, the United States went 6 years without any comprehensive spectrum strategy. During those 6 years, drown-out spectrum disputes compromise our ability to maximize our use of this vital resource. If America is to remain the pace setter for global innovation, we need to maintain consistency on our spectrum policy. Mr. Lewis, how is a national spectrum strategy keeping the U.S. on track to lead on their wireless technologies? And why is it important and critical to continue its work?
Yes, Congressman, the spectrum strategy was an important step forward. It laid a path for us to follow in studying 5 spectrum bands that could create a pipeline in the future. It talked about long-term planning and research into technological developments like dynamic spectrum sharing that can make the use of those bands more efficient. And hopefully also points in the direction of continued cooperation between federal and non-federal users. So it is an important step forward. We need to continue to move
it.
on.
Thank you. Mr. Gillen and Mr. Powell, can the United States afford to delay studies of spectrum bands and undo the national spectrum strategy's progress in increasing spectrum access? Mr.
Absolutely. Absolutely no.
Okay.
I agree with Mr. Gillen. It's important to quickly study these bands and get them into the market.
Okay, thank you. I've been a strong advocate for modernizing our telecommunications network through open, interoperable solutions that diversify our supply chains and create new opportunities for American innovators to compete in the market. Ms. Rinaldo, the DoD has partnered with members of the Open RAN Coalition to leverage commercial wireless technologies for secure, resilient networks. What next steps should U.S. spectrum policy take to ensure we can continue to enhance national security through commercial innovation?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. The DoD has been incredibly bullish on Open RAN and are actively working with my member companies to deploy 5G around the world. Unfortunately, their budgets continue to get cut.
Mhm.
So in 2025, I think people would be shocked how little 5G is deployed at our DoD bases around the world. So I'd say continued funding, continued partnership, and it's great to see the two sides, the commercial side and the public side, working together to deploy commercial technologies.
Certainly. Thank you. Spectrum demands continue to grow, and there's no more easy spectrum to access. We must have a unified federal spectrum policy to continue the work towards sustainable spectrum pipeline that benefits the American people. Mr. Lewis, how have American consumers and innovators been harmed in the past when the federal government failed to speak with a unified voice on spectrum policy?
I think our innovators are looking for reliability on where they can
Mhm.
design, and so the national spectrum strategy that you mentioned and setting a clear path forward on what bands can be used in the future is important for providing that certainty for innovators.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gillen, I've worked collaboratively across the government for years to advance America's spectrum policy. Can you tell me why it matters that the government speaks with one voice and why it matters what other nations do with spectrum?
For us to succeed, we need one voice, and really appreciate your leadership, really pushing the NTIA to be at the forefront. We need the expert making these calls and to get some rid of some of the turf wars we're fighting. When you think about it, the US is a big market, but we're only 4% of all the global wireless connections in the world. So for order to succeed, we need to amplify our voice. We need to make sure other countries are using our equipment, are using our spectrum, everything Mr. Ronaldo said. So it's critical that we lead and we lead first.
Thank you. Cutting-edge technologies like dynamic spectrum sharing hold great promise in efficiently using our finite spectrum resources. There are a number of possibilities to leverage emerging technologies like artificial intelligence to better manage spectrum, as published in the National Spectrum Research and Development Plan. Mr. Powell and Ms. Ronaldo, how can, quickly answer, investments in emerging technologies like AI improve spectrum efficiency and management? Mr. Powell?
I think it's critical. I mean, you can bet on technological innovation to resolve conflict, or you can rely on political regulatory conflict to resolve conflict. We think there's stunning advances in the ability to use spectrum more efficiency, and more importantly, to allow multiple users to use the same bands simultaneously without interference, allowing greater competition and greater innovation.
Ms. Ronaldo, you've got 7 minutes, 7 seconds. Can you just
Yes,
answer?
absolutely. I think with Open RAN, the use of AI, you're going to see a lot of use cases, especially in spectrum management.
Okay, thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair will recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the recognition. And Ms. Ronaldo, it's great to see Cole here. Not many of us on this committee remember and used to work for a member of this committee. And it's hard to believe I've been here that long because he's 10 years old now. That I remember when you were having him. So my question is, I know we have newer members and some of us need refresher as well. So NTIA, which you were leading in the previous administration, or now, well, I don't know if it's still previous, 45, it manages the federal spectrum, but a lot of agencies try to manage their own federal spectrum. Can you explain how that's not supposed to work and the problems of what that causes when that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So fragmentation is one of the worst things that we could do to move things forward. You would lose everything from the efficiencies that you gain through the IRACs, where all the federal agencies come together to discuss management of spectrum, to national security concerns. Can you imagine if each agency was responsible for cybersecurity of their individual bands? It would be disastrous for
But
the
some
country.
agencies try to do that, right?
Some would like to, yes.
Okay. So, all right. We heard Chair Hudson and Ranking Member Matsui talk about disputes going into these international bodies, and just kind of a refresher for some, and some are new to the committee. So at the 2023 World Radio Communication Conference, there were disputes that went in that made us less effective. So if you would talk about what I know there were several, but kind of highlight a couple of the disputes, why that made us ineffective or less effective. I was in that effect, less effective. And if we go into those international groups less effective, how China will take advantage of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of prep work that goes into these events years ahead of time. We work with others around the world to ensure that we can have a unified response, not just U.S., but partners as well. And so if we are still arguing over policy decisions as we go into these standards bodies, then we're not able to speak with unified voice.
So what kind of policy discussions were happening?
So-
What were we arguing over?
Spectrum bands.
Spectrum bands.
Yeah. So everything. So right, the adversary wants the chaos, because if there's chaos internal amongst us, that means we're not fighting them for our strongest hand in our position.
So these international standard setting bodies set the standard, because obviously spectrum knows no border, because it's physics in the air. Only I know Mr. Obernolte can explain it. I can't, but we do know that it crosses borders. And so what advantage does China have if they get the leverage? I mean, what could they do with having the leverage in those? What kind of standards could they influence that's negative to us and positive to them?
So it does advantage their vendor community a great deal. It's incredibly expensive to put together a radio. And so if you're walking in and if your standard's accepted, then you're going to have the first mover's advantage. And that's what we want.
So like what kind of standards? I mean, just kind of more details. Would they?
Yeah, so whatever bands. So you're going to have transistors in all your radios. And so that becomes incredibly expensive. You're going to want to ensure that you have this. So other countries around the world are on the same bands that China is. And so that's what their aim is just to coalesce everyone together.
So it's kind of like if they become the dominant player, then everybody else has to play. If you want to be interoperable,
Right.
most people want to be interoperable with the dominant player.
Correct.
And
We
so
wanna
if
be
they
the
become the
leader, not-
dominant player, then we have to follow them instead of them follow us.
Correct.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I do have another minute if anybody wants the time. If not, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair will recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes. Ask your.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned by reports suggesting that Republicans would rather spend $70 billion in spectrum auction proceeds on tax cuts for the rich instead of investing this money in bipartisan public safety priorities such as Next Generation 911, which is going to save the lives of a lot of Americans, including first responders. Let me go to Mr. Lewis. To the best of your knowledge, has Congress ever directed spectrum auction proceeds to pay for tax cuts for billionaires?
Not to my knowledge.
All right. And why is using spectrum auction proceeds to deploy NG 911 networks a worthwhile investment, if you would?
I view NG 911 as an important public interest need that makes all Americans benefit from secure networks, faster emergency services, and it matches the mandate of the Communications Act that says that we should push to have all Americans connected to reliable, secure, affordable communications.
Well, thank you. I mean, obviously, I'm very proud of the fact that we've used spectrum in the past for public purposes and don't want it to be just used for tax cuts for, corporate or billionaires. We're debating spectrum policy, but here in this committee, but as far as the people in my district are concerned, they just want to know what we're doing to make their monthly bills more affordable. That's what they care about, bottom line. They can't afford things. They want us to bring prices down. So, Mr. Lewis, do you think that the FCC should require, through licensing or other means, wireless service providers to offer an affordable service option, that we should require that, if you will?
I think that would be okay. I don't think it would be a substitute for restoring the low-income subsidy for broadband that we lost last year. Even with a low-income option, there's a cost to low-income people in every state and every district. So yes, but it's not all we would need.
You think some of those other things are just as important, certainly?
I think the subsidy is very important. It was proven, over 20 million people signed up for it before it went away. And folks are making difficult budgetary choices without it.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with you that that was a major accomplishment, and we should try to continue or expand it. The last question I wanted to ask, and I could ask it both Mr. Lewis and Mr. Powell, possibly too, if you like. The Biden administration made great strides in advancing the U.S. spectrum policies by adopting the National Spectrum Strategy, which got bipartisan support in this committee. And this strategy requires the federal government to undertake studies of certain spectrum bands before making any final decisions on whether or how they should be made commercially available. So let me start with Mr. Lewis and then Mr. Powell. We've got a couple of minutes. Will completing these studies allow us to more effectively compete against China and other countries? And if so, how? If you could take a minute and we'll ask Mr. Powell.
I'd say yes, actually for some of the reasons that Ms. Ronaldo was talking about, to point in a unified direction. Instead of the disputes we had between different agencies in the past, the studies can really set what the scientific facts are about how different bands will work and the technologies using it. And then hopefully coordination can be built off of those scientific facts.
Okay, Mr. Powell,
I would just quickly say that the bands that were being evaluated are the very bands that all of us are sitting here asking for the government to get into the market. We all have acknowledged those bands are heavily encumbered, and so there's complex questions associated with the current users and potential commercial use. So at some level, no matter what form it takes, there has to be continued evaluation of the viability of doing that and the appropriate approach to doing that.
all right, thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Allen. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hudson, for yielding. And now we'll get back to the subject we came to talk about. Mr. Powell, can you explain why it's important to our strategic competition with China for your members to have more spectrum made available for their use?
Yes, sir. I think attacking China is a multi-front war. And I think, to follow the advice of Sun Tzu, don't attack where they're strong, attack where they're weak. Our innovations in Wi-Fi are unprecedented in the world. China does not appreciate or embrace that technology approach because it would empower their citizens in a way that they're unwilling to do in their communist system. And this gives America an enormous competitive advantage because we harness the innovation potential of every one of our citizens, and they don't. They have a command and control exclusive license regime because they want to maintain control
Right.
of that regime, and they want the world to use their approach as well.
Good, thank you. Ms. Ronaldo, can you give me an answer to that question about why it's important for your members to have more spectrum to compete? China?
Excuse me, absolutely. So if you want to get Open RAN deployed, we need new spectrum to bring online. It's updating networks. It is U.S. and our allied friends around the world's innovation that's coming to bear.
Okay. Today I will be introducing the Spectrum Pipeline Act, which was originally co-led last Congress by Senators Cruz and Thune. This bill is designed to ensure the efficient allocation of mid-band spectrum, a resource critical for the advancement of 5G and next-generation technologies. Wireless communications technology is a cornerstone of our strategic competition with China. This bill lays out a path for us to promote wireless innovation while protecting national security interests. Mr. Gillen, can you explain why the Spectrum Pipeline Act is needed and how it would benefit the nation's economic and national security interests?
Absolutely, and thank you for your leadership and for the bill. It's a really important thing to address a lot of the challenges we're talking about, that we need to move quickly, we need to move decisively, and it's Congress's role to set that direction. And that structure you propose is flexible. It allows the agencies to act to determine which bands are right that we need to do together. But ultimately, when we're trying to talk about China, in our view, we need to be the best of the world at unlicensed, and we are today. We also need to be the best of the world in 5G. We shouldn't be choosing. We need to do both, and we need to have the innovation available on both of those platforms. And so your bill would help equalize that imbalance we have right now on the 5G side to put us in a position. We lead the world today in unlicensed spectrum. We can again in 5G with this kind of bill.
Good, thank you. Mr. Gillen, my rural district still does not have consistent mobile phone service. What assurances can you give me that your member companies are making the necessary investments in upgrading their cell towers and building new ones as necessary?
Absolutely. It's a project every day that we continue to build. It's one of the things why it's important when we talk about what kind of spectrum is available, why full power spectrum matters. That if you think about some of the models, the sharing models we're using, you need 7 times more the facilities to cover the same geography. So when we're trying to get out beyond Augusta, what are we trying to do? How far that signal goes matters. There's also a role for the government, the 5G fund at the FCC, to help supplement and complement those places to help us push out faster. But absolutely, we need to get further than we are today.
Is there anything Congress can do to help us, help companies build more towers in the rural areas of the country?
Certainly, continued work on permitting reform would help to cut down, modernize that process to let us build faster and get to more places, and more full power spectrum would be both great.
And then finally, I've got about a minute. Can you explain the difference in the approach of spectrum policy between the first Trump administration and the recent Biden administration? And what exactly needs to happen to get spectrum policy out of the gutter and back on track? And how long will it take?
We saw great success. The first Trump administration released more spectrum than any other administration, particularly some of the mid-band spectrum we're talking about. Under the Trump direction and Mr. Ronaldo's leadership, we saw a 380 megahertz of spectrum, mid-band spectrum auction for over $100 billion. The spectrum directly adjacent to both of those is prime spectrum for that same opportunity again. So it came down to, we had a lot of, we were speaking with one voice, and the White House pushed us all forward with a good plan.
So it's important that this committee understand that we've got to move quickly with this, and we need to move in a bipartisan way and quit talking about political issues, and let's get this done, and so we can lead the world in communications technology. And I want to thank each one of you for being here today and for your input on this important subject. And please help us get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. I'll now recognize the representative from Florida, Mr. Soto, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Spectrum's one of our most valuable commodities, our information superhighway. When I think about all the uses from cell phones and getting to 6G to AI and commercial rockets in Central Florida, by the way, telehealth, streaming, gaming, internet, e-commerce, one of the greatest economic inefficiencies we have is buffering, the dreaded spinning wheel. I even remember when it used to be an hourglass. A lot of you may remember that. And so it's critical for us to ensure access to spectrum for these commercial and technical uses. Unfortunately, Congress allowed the FCC's auction authority to lapse back nearly 2 years ago. And we saw, the Department of Defense, our military, they need to defend the nation. But with nearly 2 years of this lapsing authority, we need to work out these differences. There's been a history of using this funding for public safety, for national security, that's communications related, whether it's FirstNet, rip and replace, broadband, and the new infrastructure law. I could tell you in rural places in my district, like South Osceola and East Orange, where they have ranches and farms and groves, using this funding in a related way to communications not only makes sense, but it's the just thing to do. Communications are only going to require more investment as technology and competition advance, especially making our telecom system more resilient to cybersecurity hacks like Salt Typhoon, which has been mentioned a bunch of times here. So we need to make sure we're reinvesting these in the telecom system and not seeing tax cuts for billionaires that'll siphon this off. Most Americans and American small businesses will suffer identity theft, ransomware, spying if we don't continue to reinvest. So first, Mr. Giles, I was shocked to see we would see China over the last 3 years nearly 4 times the amount of mid-band spectrum for commercial use unleashed. And just so we're clear, it's been a bipartisan opposition in the Senate through DOD, through Senator Rounds. I see Senator Hirono too, who helped slow this down. What are the consequences if this continues to happen?
Thank you for the question. I think the consequences is where you started. It's the buffering hourglass. And when we talk about what these networks can do, it's inconvenient on a phone call when we want what 5G and we want connectivity to do in manufacturing, in healthcare, and transportation. We need these to be a heavily reliable and resilient network. So it has to work. And so ultimately at its core, that advantage in China is giving them legs up in their ability to innovate. There are 14 times more 5G connected factories in China than in the US. You can draw a direct line back to our spectrum policy. They're continuing to move forward. There's 4 global bands for 5G right now. They support 3, we support 0. We need to get on the playing field. We need to start competing again.
Ms. Rinaldi, you were head of NTIA. When you had worked with the DOD on these issues, what was their hesitancy? I feel like I get it, there's national security implications to this, but what are some of the things you can disclose of why there's still that tension there that's blocking a lot of this from coming forward?
Yes, I feel that there's a lack of trust. They, of course, have national security aims that they need to protect, and the industry wants those protected too. But there are so many efficiencies coming online. How can we ensure all users, public and private, are taking advantage of these efficiencies? And so I think that's what we really need to get back into this conversation is how do we get the trust back? We're all one country.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, if you could have a top 3 reinvestment in telecom and in communication systems with the proceeds of spectrum sales, what would it be?
Top 3, definitely NG 911, which we've talked about. Number 2 would be digital inclusion efforts on the ground. Congress's investment in the bipartisan infrastructure law and in digital inclusion efforts on the ground was the first of its kind, but it's not permanent. Spectrum Auction Authority could create a permanent fund. And then other infrastructure needs, resiliency, there may be others, but spectrum auction proceeds are hard to predict as well. The Those auctions, since there's no greenfield space, come with costs as well. So prioritizing would make sense.
Thanks, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Latta for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being with us today. This is really a great conversation. Our national security depends on the United States maintaining an edge in advanced technologies. This committee has acted decisively over the years to meet this goal. Autonomous vehicle legislation, securing Americans' data from communist Chinese collection, and advancing spectrum policies like the Beat China for 5G Act of 2020. The expiration of the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority is not something I take lightly. An auction authority remains crucial for wireless technologies to have the ecosystem to develop and thrive in the United States. If I can start my questioning, Mr. Powell, and there's been a lot of discussion back and forth, but I'm going to get your thoughts on this. In your testimony, you speak to the American innovations that have come to thanks to unlicensed spectrum availability. Do you expect that as technology continues to develop, coexistence or some sort of sharing in a band will be easier or have less interference? And before you answer, you really went in depth in your testimony on shared spectrum. But the question, we've been going around and around on this because I've been on this committee for almost 15 years, especially with DOD. And we just heard from Ms. Ronaldo talking about, having some kind of working relationship back and forth and having that trust. But how do we get there? Because we can do a lot of talking, but how are we going to get that because we're going to have the spectrum?
Yeah, I think if you look at the examples of Wi-Fi and the CBRS spectrum, you will look at dramatic increases in our ability to utilize advanced technologies to allow conflicting uses to coexist cooperatively. That allows you to get the spectrum out, have all users who need it have access to it, and be able to provide services in new and innovative ways. I think one of the trust problems is the Defense Department and others believe, and I've worked with them for many years, including when I was chair of the FCC, they lose trust when they feel like people are hunting to take the spectrum completely away from them and not offer them an alternative. They're charged constitutionally with protecting our borders, protecting the United States national security. And I can tell you, a flipping hourglass while you're watching a video is one thing. A loss of 3 milliseconds on a missile intercept means you miss. And that's a very fundamental loss of capability. So you can understand the conflict. It takes talented leaders and policymakers to bring that trust back. But I would argue looking more fully at shared spectrum models would allow them to see a future in which they can continue to operate while coexisting with commercial users.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Renato, some of the conversations we've had in the past related to the benefits of O-RAN networks. How does having a diverse spectrum ecosystem strengthen our national security and protect against foreign cyber attacks?
Excuse me, I keep doing this. You never want an over-reliance on a single band. That's why it's important to diversify. I think all you have to do is look to GPS, where it is incredibly vulnerable because all of our eggs in one basket. You don't want to create a high-value target.
Thank you. In your testimony, you mentioned that the United States cannot and should not try to act more like China when it comes to spectrum management. What are some of the areas we should be looking at to encourage that innovation here while spreading American wireless values abroad?
So they operate by fiat. They have a handful of companies as opposed to us, where we have hundreds of companies in this space. So it's important to bring them together to collaborate, multi-stakeholder through government, public-private partnerships. And so that's where we do have the innovative edge.
Well, thank you. Mr. Gillen, are there bands that have already been studied by NTIA that should be part of the spectrum pipeline?
Our studies have studies. Absolutely. The structure really, there's many different ways that you can structure the bill. You can direct. In the past, you've directed, you must auction this particular band. Sometimes it's amount of spectrum within a range. The clear priority for us is that you include a plan with auction authority, and there's lots of different ways it can do it. In terms of specific bands, absolutely. The 3 gigahertz band and the 7-8 gigahertz band are 2 global bands. They're both identified by the National Spectrum Strategy. We think those are key parts of the roadmap going forward.
Well, thank you very much. Anyways, and in this Congress, we've got to do, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, on our Spectrum Auction Authority to get this done. It's just not for making sure that we have dollars coming in to on the federal side, but it's also so absolutely essential out there that we get the spectrum out there. And so, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can get this done this Congress, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. I'll now recognize the representative from California, Mr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to serve on this subcommittee. I represent California's 25th district, the southeast corner of California, where far too many of my constituents are dealing with persistent issues of limited broadband access, inadequate cell coverage, and aging infrastructure. It's one of the most under-resourced rural communities in the state of California. And in communities like mine, the lack of reliable high-speed internet creates obstacles. Students are unable to fully engage in online education. Small business struggles to remain competitive, and families are disconnected from critical services. The need to expand broadband access to tribal nations is particularly pressing because they face some of the lowest connectivity rates in the nation. And addressing this digital divide will not only ensure equitable access to education and economic opportunity, but it would also provide essential services like telehealth to communities that need it most. And especially our vulnerable communities during the pandemic, we saw that the lack of access made them even more vulnerable. And we must prioritize modernizing our telecommunications infrastructures to close this gap and build a stronger, more connected future for all Americans. Mr. Lewis, could you speak to how the absence of broadband access affects the community, and in particular, what the national security implications might be?
I think you started with some great explanations. I saw some of those examples firsthand. I served on the school board in Alexandria for 6 years and saw students who did not have connectivity and how it impacted their ability to compete and to get a full education. Broadband connectivity promotes economic development and opportunities to reach a global marketplace for adults as well, and is incredibly important for communities.
Thank you.
And we're here talking about spectrum policy. There's so many different ways to serve rural communities like yours, and certainly the investments in the BEAD program that get fiber hopefully out to as many communities as possible is important for wireless, because you can't have wireless connectivity and towers without the fiber backbone that those towers connect to.
Yeah.
And then finding other ways to use different sort of spectrum deployments, whether it's licensed spectrum, whether it's shared spectrum, whether it's Wi-Fi, like unlicensed spectrum, like TV white spaces.
Yeah.
The spaces between the channels, the TV channels, is used for broadband deployment. So there's so many different ways to.
I mean, we need those during disasters for
Yes.
communications, one of the critical things that we need them for. And so these connectivity gaps also pose critical risk during emergencies, where reliable communication networks are essential for delivering timely information, ensuring the safety of all Americans. Last week, on January 10, 2025, due to various reasons, 911 outages were reported in the Coachella Valley, where I represent, particularly in Cathedral City and Indio. Residents who relied on AT&T and Frontier services were unable to reach 911 for several hours. First responders directed people to call alternate numbers or text 911, which are not always available or reliable options. And this is not the first time people in my district have experienced this. As an emergency physician, I've witnessed firsthand how every second counts during an emergency. Not being able to reach first responders is simply unacceptable. In the 118th Congress, this subcommittee on a bipartisan basis made significant strides towards providing federal and state governments with the resources necessary to transition to nationwide IP-based next generation 911 systems. This technology will modernize our outdated 911 infrastructure and will allow text, photos, and videos to be sent to 911, improving communication during emergencies and location tracking, and ensuring better coordination during natural disasters like the ones we experienced, Tropical Storm Hillary, and then also the LA wildfire. So could you elaborate, Mr. Lewis, on the specific benefits investments in NG 911 will bring to our communities?
I think it starts with the idea that when an emergency happens, what do a lot of us do? We grab our phone, we take it with us. It's our lifeline to emergency services and our families.
People are more likely to die when they're having a cardiac arrest and they can't get the paramedics to their home to help them because of lack of N11. So I think when we're looking at spectrum auction, we should be using the funds to expand NG 911 and help save everyday American lives, rather than trying to use those funds to give millionaires and billionaires more tax breaks, people that need it the least. We should be serving the American people who need it the most. Everyday, middle-class, hardworking Americans who rely on 911 systems to save lives. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now recognize the representative from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much, and congratulations. You're going to make a great chairman. I have to admit, though, I was surprised that Congress let Spectrum Auction Authority lapse, let alone for 2 years. At least we can say that the House did its job in trying to reauthorize Spectrum auctions last Congress. But this clearly remains a top priority for members of this committee on both sides. As we move forward, we shouldn't just be simply thinking about reinstating auctions, but also consider process reforms. In the past, federal agencies have attempted to stymie auctions, sometimes even after an auction is held and bidders have won provisional licenses. Mr. Gillen, how does the uncertainty of post-auction agency meddling impact the value of a spectrum license, and what can Congress do to address these problems in the future?
Thank you for the question. You're exactly right. Bidders hate uncertainty. Capital hates uncertainty. And therefore asking companies to spend tens of billions of dollars on an asset, there's expectations that they're going to be able to quickly then use that to deliver service to consumers. Unfortunately, that has not always been the case recently. I think it comes back to some of what Mr. Ronaldo said about the need for one voice and NTIA to make those calls. And ultimately, agencies and industry and everyone needs to live by that decision. And we need to get back to that place that you could help empower the spectrum experts at the FCC and NTIA to be the ones that have to make the hard choices among how all of us want spectrum to be used.
Thank you very much. Mr. Powell, in the aftermath of the historic double hurricanes that slammed Florida and North Carolina and other parts of the South, and the wildfires that destroyed cities in California, these communities need to rebuild from scratch. How will permitting policies impact rebuilding efforts, and what can Congress do to more quickly and cost-effectively rebuild robust networks in these areas, potentially allowing them to achieve a citywide network like Charter has done in Charlotte, North Carolina? If you could answer that, I appreciate it.
Yes, I think you mentioned most importantly that efficient receipt of permitting is essential. Our members often in communities run into situations which they're ready to lay fiber across an enormous expanse of rural, and you've been waiting for a permit for 2 years. This both happens at both the federal and the state level. I think there are other things about recovering infrastructure in disasters like in Florida, North Carolina. For example, how do we get poles back up, and what quality poles do we put? Are we just going to put the same poles that blew down and broke? Or are we going to improve those, not only for withstanding the elements, but also being able to handle the expansion of broadband that we're all looking for in the BEAD program? We've had companies like Charter who've been on the ground in both in LA and North Carolina, have learned a lot about how we improve coordination with power companies and utilities to avoid infrastructure being cut after it's been restored, which is something we run into a lot in these situations. So I think Congress and local governments can play a major role in improving the way we recover from these disasters.
Thank you very much. During his first term, President Trump signed an executive order that streamlined environmental permitting processes for infrastructure projects, particularly highlighting projects to increase public safety. Due to this executive order, Pasco County, Florida, which is in my congressional district, was able to finally get a project shovel-ready after nearly 25 years of bureaucratic red tape, if you could believe it. This streamlining was eventually rolled back by President Biden. On Tuesday, President Trump once again signed an executive order significantly streamlining the environmental permitting process for infrastructure projects. Some experts are even suggesting this order could cut down permitting timelines from the better part of a decade down to 1 year or under 1 year. Mr. Gillen, historically, about how much time and money is spent on the environmental review process as opposed to physically building the networks to reach new customers and/or improve service for existing customers?
According to the Commerce Department stats, it can take well over 2 years, which in often case is a decision of whether or not we're going to build or not. That particularly when we have the conversation, you dovetail spectrum policy, we're not getting spectrum out quickly, and then how quickly can we actually deploy it on the permitting side to get sites built to build networks further out. And then oftentimes the cost is considerable, but the time is really what hurts in our ability to actually build out these facilities as quickly as we want to. So I think any steps to modernize those permitting programs to allow us to do that more quickly with more certainty and transparency can be a game changer in terms of how quickly we can amplify what you do on spectrum.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I'll now recognize the representative from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to working with you on this subcommittee. It's the first time I've been on this subcommittee. One of the benefits of seniority, besides creaky knees, is when the third committee comes around, you can choose a new one. So I'm happy to be here. And throughout my time in Congress, I prioritized some of the main pillars of our economy in San Diego, two of which I think are directly implicated here, just science and innovation, and also our military presence. In San Diego, we take pride that our industries are at the forefront of innovation. Qualcomm is headquartered in my district. It plays a pivotal role in the progress of 5G and 6G technologies and what we can achieve with a balanced spectrum policy. A common complaint I hear from innovators like Qualcomm is that more spectrum is needed to meet demand from an increasingly online population and to be able to compete with competitors abroad. And you've already talked extensively about that in some ways. Mr. Gillen, can you describe a little bit about the increasing demand for low cost, high quality broadband services and how that relates to the need to make spectrum more commercially available?
Absolutely. One of the exciting things 5G has created is our ability to compete in the home broadband market. So we can now provide an option in both rural areas and areas where we have not as much competition as you have traditional mobile space. But we've seen that to be a greatly attractive product. If 10 million households have signed up to that product, but ultimately at the end of the day, the ability to deliver that service, the promise of $8 billion by one study of savings to households, if we could roll that out. We don't have enough spectrum to actually keep delivering that everywhere. We already have a company with a 1 million person waiting list for spectrum, means that person has broadband.
Right. How about how efficient would you say the wireless industry is with the current spectrum holdings, and what opportunities are there for the federal government to be more efficient with the spectrum that it uses?
It's a critical question. We all need to be more efficient. I think if you think about it from our perspective, 20 years ago, this was cutting edge wireless technology. We reinvent every 10 years. Our network gets created. We get more efficient. We're 42 times more efficient. We have government systems from the 70s still out there. So it really is a matter of for all of us to be in a position to make sure that those equipment, that we get the government better resources, better tools to be as efficient as we can be as well.
Like I used to carry around a slide rule. That's really going back. The IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, directed the Department of Defense to study and plan for making specific segments of spectrum available for shared federal and non-federal use to potentially identify frequencies for auction. Mr. Powell, given your service in the military and as a former chairman of the FCC, can you tell me why it's important for the federal government to take a comprehensive approach, including national security implications when studying spectrum currently used by DoD for potential commercial use?
Yeah, I think we've all celebrated the value of spectrum, but we need to understand it's valuable for multiple important public uses. Not only commercial uses for consumers and businesses, but critical systems this nation relies on. Everything from NASA to OSHA to the oceanographic isn't what I meant, and our national security. I was a soldier in the field. I was a cavalry scout, and you know what I was trained to do when the Russians come through the gap? Find the antennas.
Right.
I mean, it's critical to shut down command and control systems in the military because that spectrum is essential to their ability to operate. Similarly, that spectrum is essential to intercepting intercontinental ballistic missiles like the dome over Israel, for example. You imagine if they didn't have the effective spectrum for that system, things would be very, very different in that community. So it's essential to the military, and we have to work it out. There is no just take it from them and we'll be fine, right? We have to have a public answer to how we replicate anything we compromise. And so the IMBERS process, IMBERS report in which the DoD studied the feasibility of sharing, came to the conclusion that it was possible to share. And frankly, if we had accepted that recommendation then, we'd be well on our way to providing the spectrum to the market under a shared spectrum model. But for whatever reason, including opposition by the wireless industry, it got restudied by the NTIA because somehow people didn't like the answer. But if we really wanted the spectrum, we could have moved off of that report.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking more about this with you. And I'll have the military in my ear and Qualcomm in my ear. And
Yes.
I'm really interested in, I think that people do send us here to work things out. And so that's what I like to do and look forward to working with you all. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. I'll now recognize the representative from Florida, Mr. Dunn, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As a returning member of the subcommittee, I want to remind my colleagues that what we map out for national spectrum usage sets the stage for all telecommunications nationally and, importantly, for the entire world. I'd like to emphasize the advantages that we enjoy in this particular Congress. We not only have a Republican-controlled House, Senate, and administration, but we have a president who actually understands spectrum policy, was very successful in spearheading some innovative and competitive policies in his first term. I'm going to read a statement from Brendan Carr, Chairman Carr, that highlights the successes. From 17 through 20, the FCC freed up roughly 6,000 megahertz of spectrum for licensed use alone, plus thousands of additional megahertz for spectrum for unlicensed use. The Trump administration put 4 times as much spectrum into the commercial marketplace for consumer use in one term than the last administration studied to put into use. 2 years ago, Congress allowed spectrum auction authority to lapse for the first time in 3 decades. This is while China edges into the lead on spectrum occupation and the offerings of its associated technologies. It's on the members of this committee in this room to lead on spectrum policy, to direct or authorize the FCC to enact authorization to auction these critical and finite resources. And it starts by asking one general question: how much spectrum does the America need for commercial use, and how much do we need for government use, and can they share the resource? And next, what are our licensed versus unlicensed needs for the commercial sector to innovate and grow? Can we strengthen and sustain U.S. leadership in the field, or will we continue to lose ground to China? Several years ago, the U.S. lagged as a country in adopting 3G technology. Europe got ahead of us. The tables turned when we switched from 3G to 4G, and America was ahead. So now as we get into 5G and 6G, we're competing with a cutthroat adversary, China. And I want to caution us that as Americans, we may feel entitled to win every big tech race and advancement, but that's by no means guaranteed unless we protect the telecommunications infrastructure, wireless ecosystems. And that includes working with the ITU and the World Radio Conference. It also includes addressing priorities like diversifying spectrum usage for streamlining for satellite, space, AI, et cetera. All of this, to keep foreign adversaries out of our telecoms. And I believe, by the way, our adversaries have proven their hostile intentions by disrupting at least 6 submarine cables in the last few months alone. My esteemed colleagues on this subcommittee enjoy a bipartisan, pro-American approach to technological innovation, which is fundamental in finding solutions to interagency debates and political disputes standing in the way of America's global competitiveness. And I look forward to finding solutions, and I trust this panel to help us. Mr. Ronaldo, I was fascinated by your testimony. In your opinion, what is the safest and most secure path for the expansion of commercial use of spectrum bands? And given your expertise in open RAN space, can you tell us what you see in the future for that technology, how we're expanding the usage of open RAN, and where we go from here?
Yeah, well, if I could give you one little quick vignette to really get your mind wrapped around it. Canada in 2022 banned Huawei. They're going through rip and replace just like we are. One of the executives at TELUS has publicly said by 2029, they're going to be 100% Open RAN because he never wants to be in this position ever again. Vendor lock is such a big part of this. So we talk about vendor diversity, but it's also about the vendor lock. It's going to allow you to be nimble, make updates as needed. So it really does have the power of national security concerns as well as commercial connectivity.
Thank you very much for that. You know, I'm looking at a list of questions here. I know I'm going to run out of time before I get there, but I'm going to submit questions to everyone on the panel. And all too often, we do not get responses. I will say that when we ask for written responses. This is not a gotcha moment. This is a chance for you to educate Congress, improve your government. And I'm sure you recognize the need for that. So, you know, please think of us as a receiving intent and not a nosy, imposing government. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I'll now recognize the representative from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for 5 minutes to ask your question.
Thank you, Chair Hudson, and thank you for the peanuts. And Ranking Member Matsui for holding this morning's hearing, and thanks to all of our witnesses for participating. You've heard some concerns already about how spectrum auction proceeds will be spent. I think Congress should invest this money in ways that benefit local communities and public interest objectives. For instance, last Congress in our bipartisan spectrum bill, some auction revenues were directed toward HBCUs and other MSIs to help them increase broadband adoption in their local communities. As one of the co-chairs of the Predominantly Black Institution, or PBI caucus, I know such funding would have enormous benefits, as these communities are too often under-resourced and lack affordable, reliable internet connectivity. Mr. Lewis, do you agree that directing revenues towards expanding broadband adoption in communities served by HBCUs and MSIs is a worthwhile investment? And if so, why?
I'd say yes. When I talked about digital inclusion efforts on the ground, many of them are being led by folks in and of very specific communities, whether it's the Black community or Hispanic community at HBCUs or MSIs. And so, yes, I think those dollars are incredibly important to support folks who know the local community well in getting people connected.
And my district is urban, suburban, and rural, and I have 4,500 farms in my district. So I can relate to what my colleagues on both sides have been saying about their constituents. The expiration of the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACP, poses a significant challenge for low-income households that depended on it to afford internet services. Unlicensed spectrum technology such as Wi-Fi has provided connectivity across all income levels due to its wide distribution and deployment. We've seen schools and libraries utilize Wi-Fi to help connect their students and patrons. Mr. Lewis, can you talk about the role Wi-Fi can play in connecting the unconnected, particularly with the expiration of ACP?
It's a powerful tool. You see libraries and schools loaning out Wi-Fi hotspots for students who don't have connectivity at home. I know we did that years ago in Alexandria when I was on the school board. The unlicensed is also important for continuing to support the next generation of diverse scientists and engineers. You talk about HBCUs. They're generating the vast majority of Black scientists and engineers in this country. If those schools don't have access to unlicensed spectrum to study new innovations and develop new devices and new innovations, then they miss out on those opportunities.
Thank you. Mr. Powell, your written testimony notes that shared spectrum models are the key to meeting our growing wireless needs. And you go on to list some of the advantages of shared spectrum. What is it about these shared spectrum bands that make them attractive to a wide range of different entities, including ISPs, schools, libraries, and manufacturers?
I think important thing to emphasize is when you do shared spectrum like we did in CBRS, you attract a whole bunch of bidders who win licenses, not just a single company or a couple of companies. So for example, in CPRS, 228 companies or entities won licenses. And when you use those licenses, they're lower power, smaller geographies, so it allows innovation in communities to set up their own wireless networks. For example, you reference HBCUs. Howard University is using shared CBRS spectrum on its campus today as a consequence of the shared spectrum policy in the CBRS auction. You mentioned agriculture. There are places all over the country that are using CBRS to manage moisture control, automatic temperatures. These are bands that they would have never had access to, but for the shared model.
My next question was, how has the development of CBR service or CBRS, advanced precision agriculture, how's that been effective?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's a company called Hearst Greenery in Missouri that has 600 acres of greenhouses, and they use CBRS shared spectrum in order to control fertilizer feeds, in order to check moisture moisture in the soil, as well as to automatically control temperature control. And they were able to access that spectrum as a consequence of that FCC auction.
My increase in farms joined me to join my colleague Rep. Latta in leading the House-passed Precision Agriculture Satellite Connectivity Act, which asks the FCC to review its rules for certain satellite services to see if there are rule changes that can be made to promote precision agriculture. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. Chair now recognizes the representative from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Hudson and Ranking Member Matsui, for holding this hearing, and to our witnesses for testifying. I appreciate that this subcommittee is starting with a topic that is clearly at the top of everyone's mind, and that is spectrum. The Energy and Commerce Committee has a longstanding commitment to smart, bipartisan policies that both modernize and govern spectrum use. Our jurisdiction is on the issue, and it has a storied history, and I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this issue. Spectrum is a finite resource, and we must ensure that we're being innovative and thoughtful when forming any spectrum legislation moving forward. Solving the Spectrum Auction Authority lapse and generating new spectrum policy is my top priority on this subcommittee, and I look forward to working with Chairman Hudson on getting this across the finish line. Mr. Powell, speaking of innovation, your members have leveraged Spectrum and its high-speed broadband networks in many groundbreaking ways and are becoming fast-growing mobile providers. Can you describe this incredible growth and competition and the role that unlicensed and shared spectrum have been playing?
Yes, you can look at how we innovatively use the spectrum that was available to enter the mobile telephone market as the fourth major player. So we use Wi-Fi, where 80 to 90% of our traffic goes over that infrastructure. We should remember 90% of the time human beings are indoors, and so they have access to that spectrum. Now we use shared spectrum and we use exclusive license spectrum. And by doing that, we've been able to create a service that's dramatically cheaper than other wireless plans. Plans from the cable companies on mobile services on average save consumers up to $700 a year on their mobile wireless services being offered by cable companies.
Mr. Gillen, can you speak to the ways in which your members have utilized licensed spectrum to innovate in the wireless space, and to what extent that has the lapse in auction authority affected your ability to innovate?
It's a great question. And I think we talked a little bit about 5G home, an example of providing the second or third choice in home broadband right now, thanks to the power of 5G home. 20% of those subscribers are new to broadband altogether, as the ability of wireless to get deeper in those communities makes a big difference. And the differences can be stark. It's up to $8 billion in savings to consumers thanks to that competition. As a practical matter, we already have companies out there that have waiting lists because there's not enough spectrum to continue to feed that competitive spirit. And so across the board, the more spectrum we have, the better we can compete both in the mobile space and in the fixed space.
And continuing, Mr. Gillen, during the first Trump administration,
100 megahertz of prime mid-band spectrum was auctioned in the 3.45 and to 3.55 gigahertz band for $22 billion. Estimated relocation costs by DoD were over $13 billion, but according to NTIA, less than $300 million have been spent. Is that band currently operational by commercial users? And if so, are they currently operating with incumbent DoD operations?
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about shared spectrum, there's different types of shared spectrum. There's dynamic sharing where it's actually real time and preemptible. That makes it hard for us to be used reliably. There's other spectrum like you're alluding to. Some systems are moving out their government systems, some stay. And the best thing we can do is get engineer to engineer together as to which systems belong here, which systems can be used more smartly elsewhere. And I think one of the auction you just referred to is one of those places that the money that is left over right now is earmarked for the Navy to design a better radar that could help in the drone environment. And so part of the magic of auctions is the Spectrum Relocation Fund Congress creates win-win opportunities that we can actually help the government get the tools they need for the modern warfare environment that we have now. So how do we get smarter? How do we share better? And we have a lot of tools available that we actually know can work, that both the military radars can work and we can coexist with 5G.
Do you think, Mr. Gillen, that the innovation that can occur with the United States Navy and other military is a byproduct of the additional funds that occur through spectrum auction?
Absolutely. This is a key piece of the puzzle to help them continue to advance and improve what we all need them to do, keep us safe.
Ms. Ronaldo, what policy priorities should Congress have when addressing developing spectrum policies in this Congress? Are there issues in spectrum, with your experience, what you bring to the table, that have not been addressed and you want to be seeing in this Congress occurring?
So I would say first and foremost, good oversight. We need a plan. We need to implement that plan, and we need to make sure that we have oversight to hold everyone's feet to the fire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for holding this important spectrum hearing today.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce. And now I recognize Representative Barragan from California for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on American leadership in wireless technology. I love to hear about the bipartisanship, and there is bipartisan agreement on the importance of extending spectrum auction authority to support our wireless networks and further innovation. However, I think it's critical the American people know how we plan to use the tens of billions of dollars that will be raised from the spectrum auction. And I also have concerns about reports that Republicans may propose to use the revenue from spectrum auctions to give out tax cuts to billionaires and corporations. Instead, I believe that we should be using those dollars, investing in things that benefit all Americans, such as through broadband and through public safety initiatives. Mr. Lewis, I'm going to start with you. After witnessing firsthand the devastating impacts of the recent wildfires in the Los Angeles area, it's clear how important it is to have a strong emergency communication when disasters strike. We often hear about people on the wrong side of the digital divide and how they miss out on essential education, health, and commerce opportunities. And you touched upon this topic briefly, but you kind of ran out of time. So I want to follow up. If you could talk more about what it means when an entire community still have old, out-of-date 911 systems.
I think without NG 911, you have you have slower responses. You have missed opportunities to get location information from people's mobile devices, other communication beyond phones like texting that help people reach emergency services faster. And so it's incredibly important that we continue to deploy NG 911 everywhere.
Thank you. And I think that's one of the reasons we should invest money from things like spectrum auctions, an important communications priority like the next gen 911. Mr. Gillen, I want to follow up with you. How do wireless networks support public safety communications and emergency alerts? And are there any additional measures we should consider to ensure people in emergencies receive timely, life-saving information to improve response efforts?
Thank you for the question, and I think the last few weeks have reinforced the importance of that program. And the wireless emergency alerts, we've sent over 84,000 during that program. And one of the things we've learned recently is we've continued to add more functionality to that program. So before it went out through a broad area, we increasingly allow smaller geographic areas to go out. We give options as to how often a message is broadcast to a community in case your phone is off or other things. I think some of the challenges we saw over the last few weeks underscores that we need to partner with those public safety originators who actually start the alert process as to how the tools work and what it actually happens. But I think at its core, it's a critical functionality that we're proud to be able to help. We need to always continue to work to make that program stronger, both in terms of how the originators add to it and the functionality we create both for consumers and for the public safety community.
Great, thank you. Mr. Powell, there is a significant workforce shortage across the telecommunications sector, with tens of thousands of skilled workers needed to meet current and future demands. What steps are the companies you represent taking to address the shortage, and particularly through workforce development and engagement with underrepresented communities?
Yeah, this actually is a very serious problem. It's one of the big problems with the BEAD infrastructure program. Our expectations of what we're going to be able to build fall short of the amount of workforce available to build it. Consequently, our companies are focused on a number of significant workforce training programs. Some of them include particularly programs targeted at veterans. We have some programs targeted at young people to help them learn the skills and develop engineering talents that allow them to move into the cable industry. And we have very ongoing efforts daily in order to bring people into the company and train them. This is not simple cut and paste work. It's important, high quality work. And we're committed to continuing to build a workforce that can allow us to bring broadband to every corner of the country.
Great, thank you. Mr. Gillen, is there anything you want to add about what the companies you represent, what they may be doing, any policy recommendations, how Congress can help fill the gaps?
Absolutely. I echo everything Chairman Powell said. We need to be in a position to have the workforce ready. I think the Wireless Industry Association is a great apprenticeship program. I think we're all working together to get people into this. These are good paying jobs. These are good opportunities. I think one of the things Congress can do is if we know over the next 5 to 10 years when spectrum's coming, those tower companies know when the work is coming. And so right now, when you talk about gaps in time between auctions and everything else, we don't know when the next one's coming. And so I think when you're looking at companies with tower builders across this ecosystem, the more certainty we can provide is a roadmap to like, I can hire because I know the work's going to be there. So I think the more certainty you can provide, but we would welcome your support because the workforce is critical to achieving everything we're doing.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Barragan. Now I recognize Representative Fortner from Idaho for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the panel, thank you for being here today. We always learn something, and every time I listen to you all talk, I realize that I know about a fraction of what I need to know about some of these things. And so thank you for being here. A couple of questions just for clarification. Mr. Gillen, I come from a state with a lot of space. There's a lot of rural area in Idaho, but it's growing, and the needs are growing rapidly. It's a fast growing state, a lot of open space, a lot of federal land, all that. But we've touched on some of this, but just for clarification purposes, would you just share what's the cost of us doing nothing? What if we do nothing in regard to licensed spectrum shortage, identifying that? What's the cost of that?
The cost of it is, at its core, at some point, this is going to stop you working the way that you expect it to work. A lot of the innovation and expectations we want to talk about, whether it's AI or anything else, isn't going to have that platform to ride on. So that we're going to need to make sure from a licensed perspective and an unlicensed perspective, we have enough spectrum to actually meet our daily needs. The first thing you're going to notice in high traffic areas, you're going to see slowing down. And that's going to get progressively worse, but really we're accustomed to our wireless service getting better each and every year. Without more spectrum, that can't happen.
Thank you for that. So that just shows the urgency that we're under here. I wanted to clarify that. Mr. Powell, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us here today. On a similar topic, let's go to Wi-Fi just for a moment. I'd like to get your input. Wi-Fi handles, as we've talked about, a lot more traffic than any other wireless technology. Wi-Fi 7 is coming. Can you touch on that and just tell us what from your vantage point, what's that going to bring, and what does this mean for spectrum policies as we advance Wi-Fi?
Yeah, if you had walked the floor of the Consumer Electronics Show this past January, you would have seen a ton of emphasis on Wi-Fi 7. Wi-Fi 7 is a next generation technology that, in short, allows faster use, faster data rates, and wider channels. One of the things we're having to manage in the home is an explosion of devices that need to be utilized on the same network. So when you get wider channels, you're able to get applications that require lower latency. So for example, 4K or 8K video, or another example would be virtual reality systems of any type, and gaming. So Wi-Fi 7 is essentially critical to the kind of devices that are coming into the home and coming into the market as we continue to innovate.
And also important for research development, the unlicensed spectrum?
Oh, 100%. We continue to use Wi-Fi in research environments, medical environments, environments that have heavy reliance on it. And the more we have these advanced systems, the better we'll be.
Thank you for that. Mr. Ronaldo, I'd like to steer a question to you. The Open RAN situation is an exciting one. Personally, as I hear you talk and as I just think through some of the things we've been through, I'm concerned about equipment made by some of our adversaries. You mentioned the Huawei and some of that. Some of those things that, quite frankly, at least some of us don't think can be trusted. What steps, if any, do you think that we should be taking in a leadership role to encourage trusted equipment, American equipment, whether it's America or anybody else, but trusted equipment? What steps should we be taking?
So the two biggest things that we face right now is lack of deployable spectrum here in the United States. So how do we get spectrum authority back up and going? How can we make more spectrum available? Also, as we look internationally, I would say how we use our investments, our international assistance programs. For instance, XM Bank, they have risk caps associated with, and telecom is such a infrastructure heavy industry. We always bump up against those caps, and so no telecom projects are able to get funded. So we're currently working with Congress on legislation that would allow XM to waive risk if we're going up against a Huawei or ZTE. So those are a handful of items that could really help make a difference in getting Open RAN deployed around the world.
Great. Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I do have more questions, but not enough time to ask them, so I'm going to put those in written form. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Fulcher, for yielding. Next is Representative Menendez from New Jersey. You have 5 minutes for questioning, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Spectrum is one of our most valuable public resources. It's become a cornerstone of modern life for American families, enabling smartphones, navigation systems, telehealth services, emergency alerts, aviation systems like air traffic control, and the list goes on. How we manage our radio airwaves has a profound impact on access to and affordability of essential services, technological innovation, and digital inclusion. So it's vital that federal spectrum policy is designed to support and benefit all Americans. This requires a range of spectrum access regimes that include both exclusive and shared use licenses for reliable networks and access to unlicensed spectrum that supports innovation. Achieving the right balance is critical. Mr. Lewis, would you agree that if we use auction proceeds to invest in our digital infrastructure and programs that serve the public interest, we can further unlock the next generation of American innovation and close the digital divide?
Yes, I think it meets the mission of the Communications Act to do so and fills the gaps that we have in making sure that everyone is connected.
Great. And I agree. That's why I join Ranking Member Pallone in his concern of reports that our Republican colleagues are instead preparing to use reconciliation to put spectrum auction proceeds towards funding tax breaks for corporations and wealthy Americans. This is why we have heard a lot of talk from Republicans about affordability and putting America first. And here we are, with a clear opportunity to invest in the public good in a way that will have a real impact on our constituents' access to affordable wireless services and on our nation's ability to lead the world in wireless innovation. So this is the moment of truth, and I invite my colleagues across the aisle to make good on their promises and join us in making life more affordable for American families, to make our communities safer by improving FirstNet, and to maintain America's leadership in technological innovation. Mr. Lewis, I believe federal spectrum policies must serve the public interest first and foremost. As we discuss extending the FCC's auction authority, we must be intentional about how licenses can provide the maximum benefit to our constituents. How should the FCC design spectrum licenses to ensure that wireless services are more accessible and affordable for our constituents?
I think it starts by using the new spectrum access models that have been studied to get the greatest benefit and the greatest efficiency of the use. We've heard at this hearing just how different bands can be used for multiple uses at the same time, including the military, while the mobile license carriers are using it, as well as unlicensed smaller power uses, all at the same time and managed through dynamic spectrum sharing. So finding the most efficient uses, I think, is incredibly important. And then after that, running auctions with the authority from Congress, hopefully, that produce additional public interest benefits like NG 911.
That's great. And excuse me, and building on that, how can licenses be structured to ensure that communities that tend to be underserved by commercial licenses are not deprived of digital opportunity?
I think the opportunity comes from those sharing examples that we've already seen some of this happen. In the CBRS band, there are great opportunities for some of the most unconnected communities in rural areas, tribal areas especially are most unconnected, to use spectrum that is not being used, that may have licenses, but prioritized, but creates opportunities for them to have community-owned built networks. And I think that's in the spirit of some of the relationships we have with our tribal communities. So that's one example. There's many others.
Yeah, that's great. I would love to continue the conversation, but down to the last minute. And in your past testimony, you noted that auctions, if designed correctly, have the potential to reshape the workforce. How can licenses be structured to promote a robust and diverse spectrum workforce and increase supplier diversity?
We've seen the FCC meet their statutory mandate to promote vendor diversity. They have the Office of Communications Business Opportunities that helps connect women and minority vendors to opportunities to work with larger carriers and big providers. They've created the ECIP program, which promotes taking licensed spectrum, but creating secondary market so that if it's not being used by the large carriers, other groups can come in and get access to that spectrum. So there's great opportunities if we design it and continue those programs.
It's great. I appreciate you all so much for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. And I'll recognize a representative from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity to have this hearing. I'll start with Mr. Gillen. I'd like to talk about the Embers report. And basically, DoD NTIA concluded that the 3 gigahertz band couldn't be cleared for exclusive use. So I kind of want to talk through a sharing model or a segment model. And really what I want to hear is what needs to happen, especially from DoD. What do we need DoD to come back with? How do we need to work together? What settings are we expecting that to happen? And I'm familiar with this band. I've used it in professional career and kind of want to get to the bottom of where we need to go process-wise.
Absolutely. And I think there's just been a misunderstanding amongst everybody as to what our goal here is. You think about the lower 3 gigahertz spectrum, it's 350 megahertz. That's almost as much a spectrum as 5G has available for it. No one thinks all those radars should go away. That's a bad idea. And too much of this conversation is, oh, we need $200 million and $200 billion in 20 years to do something that no one's asking them to do. That ultimately, we need to get to a place that we have engineer to engineer. We think segmentation makes the most sense around what's happening globally. So if you look at just the top 150, and then in that top 150, what are those systems? There are systems, there's a missile defense facility in Alaska. No one should move that. There's no need to move that. There's AWACS, there's the airborne system out there that's going to get replaced by Wedgetail in 2032. So let's talk about what's available in 2032. There's other systems, let's say it's using channel 5. It's like old TV, can it work on channel 3? Other systems, can we talk about, can we use it smaller channels if we actually invest? Some of the money from the last auction is going to the Navy to move S radars to X radars that are actually better in a drone environment. So we think that we've got to get away from a binary choice. It's either the military or wireless. We need both. We just need to be smarter and more efficient. And we just start with getting engineers talking on a system by system basis, understanding your needs, understanding our needs, and making everybody stronger.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think working together, and I use those AI radars. I flew those aircraft. I used the services of aircraft like AWACS, and I think the time and geographic, the ability to bifurcate those and to separate. So I want to explore more on the segmentation process. Mr. Powell, I'll let you answer there, and I've got a question for Ms. Ronaldo after that.
Well, I think I could only incrementally add that, I mean, the answer we just heard sounded a little bit like finding ways to share. And that's exactly what we're supporting. I think the big conflict is, are we going to move forcefully in that direction, following the examples and precedents we've had in the past to do so? Or are we going to continue to fight over how much we can actually take away for full-powered exclusive use by the commercial industry? I mean, I appreciate that you could go through system by system, but I think we also have to respect the military experts' judgments on what they need and how they need it. Those of us in industry, engineers or otherwise, aren't necessarily the best people to make those national security decisions.
Do you feel like that we have been together in the right rooms at the right classification level to understand each other?
I probably don't have enough direct experience to answer that question, but I would say, look, there's a component of what happens on the military side that stays behind a confidential curtain. You have to trust that people are protecting things that must be protected. But typically, we learn enough about what they're doing to have a pretty good appreciation of what the sort of range of possibilities is.
I'm convinced that we can share. I'm convinced that there's a plan that we can make work. And actually, the benefit will be innovation, and that will benefit DOD as well. It's a finite band. Ms. Ronaldo, I'll come to you. In your testimony, you talk about the role standard setting bodies such as the World Radio Conference, Radio Communications Conference, and what that plays in shaping technology. I think there's some concerns about that process and concerns about getting to that conference and having the U.S. take a leadership role. What needs to change in that process, and how do we affect it better beforehand?
So I think there's been a lot of chaos going into the WRC, and it's so incredibly important that we go in and we have debate, right? We have the fight in the room. That's where great ideas happen. But then when we leave that room, we need to have a decisive decision, and people need to stick to that decision, and that's been the breakdown. So if we're at WRC and we're still fighting, then our adversary is winning.
Mr. Chairman, great hearing today. Our national security depends on this. I'm convinced that innovation will result from moving forward with an auction. Yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman yielding back, and I appreciate your perspective on this. I think your experience in the military uniquely qualifies you to help us figure this out. And I think this committee is determined on both sides of the aisle to figure this out. So thank you. The chair now recognizes a representative from Virginia, Ms. McClellan, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Hudson and Ranking Member Matsui, for convening today's hearing. As many of you know, I began my legal career a little over a year after the Telecommunications Act of 1996 passed. That is how I started as a lawyer. I ended as a lawyer right before coming here 2 years ago, figuring out how to implement the BEAD program and to expand broadband. I have witnessed had a front row seat at the table, witnessing the transition of the telecom industry from a regulated monopoly, where mainly landline was the form of communication, to now a Wi-Fi based, wireless based, data based industry. And I have seen firsthand the explosion in the use of and the demand for more bandwidth, for more and more data growing at an explosive rate. So I am very excited that my first hearing as a member of this committee has brought me back home dealing with issues that I have dealt with since I was a baby lawyer. And with that, I would like to first focus on the discussion we've had about spectrum being a finite natural resource that does found the foundation for technical innovation in our dramatically increasing digital world. Its allocation and utilization carry significant potential to either bridge or widen the digital divide, particularly for our rural, underrepresented, and marginalized communities. And so for Mr. Powell and Mr. Lewis, could you elaborate on the benefits of unlicensed spectrum, including how it has historically driven innovation and expanded connectivity, especially in underserved rural and tribal communities?
Thanks. I'm happy to go first. I'd say a couple things real quickly. First of all, it's important to understand how much value Wi-Fi brought to the typical American family over the way the internet first unfolded. When I was first at the FCC, you paid $60, you got a single connection, and you got one computer to operate on that connection. Today, that price is about the same, and every single person in the house can use it. So you've dramatically increased the value and the affordability of the service for all communities. Secondly, the thing that we're learning is Wi-Fi is very effective as a public resource. Anybody can get on it in the airport, in the public park, in the library, in the famed McDonald's parking lots where students have studied at times. During the pandemic, we wouldn't have survived without Wi-Fi being able to allow us to operate at home. The other thing is, as we move to shared models, we're learning that people can take matters into their own hands. I have a great respect for the wireless industry. They're great, but they have challenges in building out infrastructure. But we, with CBRS, we empowered local communities to set up their own wireless networks. We have small utilities who are able to use CBRS and provide services to their communities. We have small wireless internet service providers who use these bands that they're able to get at low cost to provide services to rural communities. So one thing to remember in the models that we're championing is that you allow anybody to take delivering wireless service into their own hands and use it privately in manufacturing facilities, in stadiums, in football fields. The NFL is going to use it for all of their 24 stadiums. So it's a democratizing approach, and I think we see a lot of benefits that come from that.
Just to add on, it is democratizing in how it impacts folks who then get to innovate on unlicensed spectrum. We talked earlier about the important research that can be done to build new devices, and we want to see that happen everywhere, whether it's on HBCU campuses or in high schools around the country. It's benefiting in both rural and urban areas. You see Wi-Fi create local networks in urban areas like Harlem, and the most remote rural areas. Tribal communities are building on multiple bands. There's in California the Enter tribe serving the Yurok and Karuk and Hopa tribes. I might have mispronounced it. Where they built their own networks using the shared CBRS structure, but on the unlicensed level.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. In my last 10 seconds, I'd just like to ask for Mr. Powell and Mr. Gillen, if you could share in written response back what steps Congress can take to ensure that vital programs like the now expired Affordable Connectivity Program can foster greater competition in the wireless market and to drive down prices while also ensuring providers have the resources necessary to deploy and maintain the networks that are necessary to provide those services. And with that, I yield back.
We'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations to you, Mr. Chair, on your chairmanship of this subcommittee. It is a great subcommittee. I served as vice chair for a while last session. I tell you, they got a great team too. So they've surrounded yourself with good people, and we appreciate it because it is extremely important. This area, as we all know, is extremely important. Mr. Gillian, I want to start with you. You said today that we, as the U.S., are watching other countries, whether it's allies or rivals, make more 5G spectrum available for their 5G networks than it is in the U.S. Can you talk more about that and what and why other countries are doing what they're doing with spectrum, why it matters, and specifically about China?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Congressman. You go around the world. England has twice as much of the spectrum that we do. Japan has 3 times as much. There's just been a recognition when you look at these demand curves, what are we going to need to actually meet that moment and also to create innovation? If you think about all the innovation in the sharing economy, all those apps that happened in the United States because 4G was the best in the world in the United States. And we need to get back to that place in 5G. What we see in China is both domestically, they want to be able to deliver innovation, manufacturing, they're pushing forward with the smart manufacturing, leveraging that spectrum. They also want to, as Mr. Ronaldo has talked, they want to export their values, their equipment through spectrum policy. So right now, globally, there's four 5G spectrum bands out there for the globe to use. China supports 3 of them. We support 0 of them for 5G. We're not in the game right now to be able to help shape where our allies, where we go, which impacts our ability, our manufacturing base to have someone to sell equipment to. It impacts our impact to innovate. So the
Good.
faster we get back to more spectrum, the better off we'll be.
Great. Thank you for that explanation. Mr. Powell, how will the unlicensed and the shared community help us address the China threat as it was just explained?
Thank you for the question. One example I'd like to share, which is Georgia-based, is the United States Marine Corps at the logistics base in Albany, Georgia, is using CBRS shared spectrum right now to advance our warfighters' abilities to use robotics on the battlefield. I think it's important to remember that, China's a threat on multiple fronts. And if they invade Taiwan, we're going to find out the most important one is whether we're able to meet that threat. So CBRS shared spectrum has been a solution on a number of military bases to allow them to set up their own private networks in order to train and operate equipment.
Good. Thank you for that. Mr. Gillian, I want to go back to you. As you know, I introduced the American Broadband Deployment Act that takes steps to eliminate the bureaucracy and the red tape. And I tell you, that's one thing the Trump administration is going to address is just all the permitting, all the regulations that go throughout all of our economy. I don't care if you're talking about healthcare, if you're talking about technology or energy. Everywhere I go, everybody's telling me permitting, regulations, crushing us. So obviously in the previous Trump FCC, they made great strides in this area, and Chairman Carr's leadership has been needed. I'm wondering, do you think it's important to codify those changes, and should we go even further?
Yes, I think your bill is a key companion to this conversation around spectrum, that in order, particularly as we're waiting years to get spectrum access, we need to hit the ground running. And I think what Chairman Carr did previously on permitting reform, we need to do more. We need to go beyond small cells to macro cells. How do we get to federal land? So I think your legislation is a key piece of how do we actually codify that common sense modernization that we need to actually get people out building again.
Do you think spectrum would be more valuable if broadband permitting was faster and more transparent at the local and the state level?
Yes, it gives us a roadmap to how quickly we can build. If you buy that asset, how quickly can you put it on the towers across the country, actually delivering service to consumers?
I think that's very important. I hear it all the time as well about problems, not only at the federal level, but at the state and at the local level as well. We need to be assisting them in that as well.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And thank all of you for being here. Again, this is extremely important. And we all know that, and we recognize that. So your input is very valuable, and we appreciate you taking time out to spend with us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chairman Hudson, and thank you, Ranking Member Matsui, for convening this important hearing. Let me also thank our panel of experts for joining us this afternoon. Finally, my warmest regards and welcome to all of my new colleagues on the subcommittee and the Energy and Commerce Committee. Spectrum policy is such an important part of this committee's jurisdiction and a fitting topic for our first subcommittee hearing of the 119th Congress, particularly given the continued lapse in the FCC's spectrum auction authority. While I'm disappointed the Senate was unable to follow our lead in the 118th Congress on auction authority, I'm proud of the work this committee has done in recent years on spectrum policy. The need to advance and enact legislation that reinstates auction authority and thoughtful spectrum policy is more important than ever given the multi-year lapse, but it is equally important that we get it right. Spectrum is a public resource and must be treated as such. Our spectrum policies must carefully balance the needs of both federal and non-federal users while fostering new innovations that maintain our global leadership. Spectrum auction proceeds must also be reinvested for the public good and not as a pay for additional tax cuts for billionaires. This committee has historically shown an ability to work in a bipartisan manner to establish a creative regulatory framework that fosters the kind of innovation and competition that made us global leaders in the first place. CBRS is a prime example of the kind of creativity that we can achieve when we work together. And I believe that together we can break this logjam and advance innovative spectrum policies that serve the public interest. At the heart of this impasse is the fundamental tension between critical national security needs and the priorities of wireless carriers. Reauthorizing Spectrum Auction Authority requires addressing this tension head-on, and a successful framework must enable technologies to coexist, ensuring that neither side feels the need to obstruct future attempts to reauthorize the authority. Having said that, Chairman Powell, in light of your response to Rep. Pfluger, what are your thoughts on spectrum sharing frameworks like CBRS, and how can this help us chart a path forward?
Yes, thank you. Think about just the number of the top line benefits when you pursue spectrum in this way. Number one, you help resolve the conflicts we've all been talking about. Rather than having a tug of war between two different important interests, we find a way to have them share. Secondly, it attracts a lot more investment. So, when you had CBRS, you had 228 winners, not one or two. They're all able then to provide a whole range of diverse services. You could provide wireless ISP service, precision, agriculture, new networks for your school, and you allow people to do that without further permission from the government. These are enormous benefits. So, I think when you add that all up, it's a very important tool in the quiver of Congress and the United States government as it tries to think about a forward-looking spectrum policy. Because no matter what, when we resolve this band, we're going to be here next year and the year after talking about wanting more, and it's going to get harder and harder. The more we squeeze, the more we try to get more juice out of the lemon, we're going to get to the pit. And we're going to have to find some new creative way to continue to have spectrum roll off the assembly line into the market.
Very well. Thank you very much. As we all know, different communities have different needs when it comes to connectivity. Mr. Lewis, can you discuss whether and how different spectrum access models affect the ability of people from different backgrounds, regardless of socioeconomic status, to access the latest wireless technologies?
Each community can use unlicensed spectrum in different ways, and we're seeing those different access models allow for that flexibility. In rural areas, we've seen the use of TV white spaces to get broadband deployment out to communities that don't have it. We've seen, I've talked about the tribal communities, but also we've seen in urban areas, folks build co-ops using unlicensed spectrum because of both sharing models as well as broad unlicensed bands that the FCC has reserved. We need to continue to do that. I can't over exaggerate, I think, the importance of Wi-Fi 7 that was talked about earlier, that the broad channels that are needed to make that happen, so that when we get 6G, when we get gigabit broadband to a lot of places, you don't want to have that slowdown when you get to the modem inside the building. Wi-Fi 7 allows for that. So all these different sorts of access models are just critically important to keep everyone connected, whether you live in urban areas, densely populated areas with co-ops and mesh networks, or in rural areas with white spaces and community-built networks.
Very well. I yield back. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Chairman.
Ms. Clark yields back. The chair now recognizes a representative from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on the new role. It is so great to be back at work on so many important issues
with our colleagues. And of course, spectrum, as we know, is critical to our economic and national security. And it's never been a partisan issue, which is honestly why I was so disappointed to hear the ranking member and several of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle attempt to assert that spectrum auction authority will be used as a means, in his words, to quote unquote give tax cuts to billionaires by extending the tax cuts from the Trump tax cut plan. Now, that is clearly a hyper-partisan and false attack, and I highly doubt that the constituents of the ranking member's district in New Jersey 6 would appreciate the 19% annual tax increase across the board on working-class families, nor would the 98,800 families in his district appreciate their family's child tax credit getting cut in half if we do not, in fact, extend the Trump tax cuts. A similar comment was echoed by a Democratic colleague from California, Ms. Barragan, which again, I don't think that her constituents in California's 44th district would appreciate a tax increase on average of $1,621 annually. So, Mr. Chairman, I felt it appropriate to set the record straight, seeing as how we are only a few hours into the first hearing of the 119th, and attempts are already being made to turn this vital issue of both economic and national importance into a political wedge. So I'm sure their constituents, just like mine, care deeply about the national and economic security and would appreciate folks staying focused on primary mission here rather than partisan attacks. So, Ms. Ronaldo, you had started down a line of answering Representative Joyce's questions, and you had mentioned oversight, talking about what you would like to see Congress do more of in this space. Please elaborate on the oversight elements that you were alluding to.
Yeah, so sometimes we've seen in the past through an interagency process, they fail to come to a decision, and then you just get to a stalemate. I think when you're talking about these issues, it's so incredibly important to continue to move the ball forward, that you as members of Congress can provide that oversight to hold feet to the fire to make sure that we are able to move forward.
Can you give any examples of a particular stalemate where a decision has kind of lingered?
Yeah, so I think somebody else asked about, actually it was Chairman Guthrie asked about other agencies looking to separate out of the IRAC system, which is the management of all spectrum management. That is so incredibly important to keep that group together. You lose all efficiencies, and it does have national security implications if agencies are protecting on their own terms and not through the collective good of the entire ecosystem.
So, in a little bit in that same vein, you started discussing, I think it was Representative Fulcher who started talking about this. You started talking about the risk caps and how telecommunications infrastructure typically gets excluded because it is so capital intensive from funding opportunities. Obviously, that hinders our ability to compete with China, as you started talking about. Can you continue down that line for me?
Sure. So XM Bank, we have the tools, they already exist. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We just need to retool them to ensure that we're able to get capital out. Again, the legislation would just would allow them to waive the risk caps if a company was up against Huawei.
Now, let's say beyond XM, I mean, is the Development Finance Corporation also an area where this is a problem?
Correct. Absolutely.
Now, talking a little bit more in the Department of Defense realm, how can we, I know obviously you talked about the risk caps, what other ways can DoD and others, can we be competitive and support operations abroad?
So I would say that DoD needs to be fully funded at their 5G department. The Open RAN Coalition, we have an excellent relationship with the 5G office and the Future G office, but their budgets continue to be cut in half, so they're unable to deploy 5G around the world.
Do you feel that in the previous radio conference that the United States was adequately represented?
I think there's lots of leadership changes that led to a disorganization.
And how would we address that disorganization going forward?
Again, it's ensuring that we get people identified and in position earlier. China has an advantage, they rule by fiat, but we go in through a multi-stakeholder process. Our process at the end of the day is going to create a broader, more impactful decision, but it does mean that we have to start hard. We have to start earlier and we have to work harder.
Excellent. My time has almost expired. I'll submit the rest of my questions in writing. Thank you to all our witnesses for appearing before us, and I'm so sorry. It is freaking freezing in
It
here.
really is. Amen.
Can we do something about that?
So cold.
It is freezing.
Well, Gentlelady
I
has
yield.
yielded back. I will assure you it's colder outside than it is inside. The chair now recognizes the representative from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so looking forward to working with you and Ranking Member Matsui on this important subcommittee. It's really critical to innovation, keeping Wi-Fi and internet affordable for our families and small businesses and to our national security. And I know this subcommittee did a lot of good bipartisan work last year, and you passed a spectrum auction bill unanimously out of committee. Why didn't it, why wasn't it brought to the floor? I'd ask, I'm just curious, what's your view on that, Mr. Powell?
Uh, What's your view of that?
Mr. Gill? Just quickly.
You know, I think I would stand with our, we have all so forcefully seen the value of the FCC spectrum auction. I stewarded that responsibility at the FCC. I think it was a tragedy that we lost it. It's important to remember when the FCC has auction authority, it's not just that they can move forward with an auction, they're empowered to find bands of spectrum to bring to auction. So they're stalemated in playing the leading role that they've always played. I think unfortunately, we get back to this issue. There is a lot of conflict about how these bands should be used and who should be using them. If people believe it's a political opportunity to bias the outcome of that study in a way that they might want, or to protect constituencies, even those protecting the Defense Department, it can lead to political stalemate, which is why we continue to believe that we have to start looking toward technological solutions like CBRS and shared spectrum to try to resolve those conflicts, as opposed to have them always thrown at your doorstep and ask lobbying and advocacy to produce a spectrum policy.
And you all have talked about it before on the lack of trust. Is there something else that I'm missing on all that? Why it didn't broadly bipartisan? Just quickly.
No, I think Chairman Powell covered it. I think a lot of the conversation right now is we're having conversations around winners and losers, and we need to get to a place that these are win-win
Yeah,
opportunities.
I agree with that.
And so
And that's one reason why we are concerned that spectrum proceeds could be used to fund tax cuts, whereas Mr. Lewis started off, this is in the public interest. You use those proceeds in the public interest. And why we're bringing it up is now the chairman of the Budget Committee, there's a list and a paper out on the street that has it pegged as spectrum proceeds as a possible pay for. And that's why we're very concerned. It shouldn't go to fund tax cuts for big corporations and millionaires and billionaires. It needs to stay in the public realm. And I can tell you back home in the Tampa Bay area, as we recover from the most damaging and costly hurricane season, and we look at it, the other damage across North Carolina to our neighbors, across fellow Americans in Southern California, no place has been immune to these extreme climate catastrophes. But you know, we're learning a lot in the aftermath. In the aftermath, we learn how to better prepare and respond. And the Florida Department of Emergency Management and the University of Florida piloted a new tool to provide emergency responders and local governments with a dependable means to share alerts. I mean, information is critical during emergencies. They have the new broadcast emergency alerting and communication operational network Beacon. It uses AI to quickly convert text into speech for AM radio broadcast, and it has the ability to translate into different languages, automating these kind of critical safety broadcasts before, during, and after a disaster. They really help the first responders. They help get critical information to neighbors at a time of need. Cell phones go down, you lose the internet. And this is the kind of critical infrastructure that Spectrum supports and that Congress should be encouraging. Mr. Lewis, in your written testimony, you say that Spectrum policy is about innovation and connectivity, and that revenue raised should serve the public interest. Is this the kind of thing you were talking about?
It is. You know, just with the public safety and emergency alert systems, when I was growing up, I'm 45 years old. When I was growing up, emergency alerts came over the television. Now they come over your phone. And so whether you're in your home or you're on the move, receiving those are critical. And so we want to support those and continue to build them. NG911 is a part of that,
Right.
as well as other resiliency and infrastructure supports that we've talked about as public interest needs.
Good, and I hope that's the tack we can take. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes a representative from South Carolina, Mr. Fry, for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Chairman, and congratulations on your chairmanship. I will note, just for the record, that I appreciate North Carolina peanuts, and they are good, but South Carolina peanuts might just be a little bit better. But thank you. This is a crash course as a new member into Spectrum and what that means for the country, and I really appreciate the discussion today. I'm glad that this is a largely bipartisan affair. Mr. Gillen, earlier you talked about China a little bit and the risks that they pose in the space of Spectrum. What are the consequences of China taking a lead in making 5G spectrum available to their carriers?
Thank you for the question. As someone with teenagers, I spent my weekend talking about TikTok. And ultimately, the core, that is China exporting technology. You go back to 4G, 3G, that was the US in that position. That's TikTok. Now imagine, extrapolate from that, impacts on manufacturing, on ports, on how we're doing so many other different things. It is that innovation runs to connectivity, it runs to capacity. And so really it is all the things we want to lead in going forward is going to go where the capacity and the connectivity are.
Thank you for that. Chairman Powell, obviously with the internet economy has drastically changed over the last 12 years. Everything is different. The way we communicate is different. The amount of video content and that we absorb is different. The way consumers use wireless technology is vastly different. How might other than, I think we've talked about auctions a lot, and how might our policies change as well, given how the world is changing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd recommend to the committee is to keep the consumer at the center of the focus of the policy. How do Americans really use spectrum? What are they most dependent on? I think one of the reasons we celebrate the Wi-Fi story is that the vast majority of Americans' interaction with the internet goes over that infrastructure. We spend 90% of our days indoors. And when we're indoors, we're utilizing those services. You're watching Netflix tonight, you're on Wi-Fi. Frankly, if you're using your cell phone 80 to 90% of the time, you're also using Wi-Fi, not even the cellular network. It is the sort of workhorse of the entire internet economy. So as you focus and align your spectrum policies, I think just keeping in mind the rapid innovation, the way consumers are evolving. You mentioned 12 years ago, the stuff in my house today, as opposed to 12 years ago, that expects to find and utilize my network is stunning compared to 12 years ago.
Thank you for that. Ms. Ronaldo, how does access to spectrum allow innovative companies like those in the Open RAN Policy Coalition to continue to lead on the design of the next generation networks? And as a follow-up, as the spectrum environment gets more congested, could new technologies like AI-driven network management help manage the spectrum issues and lead us to more commercial spectrum on the market?
So I would say that Open RAN is a nascent concept, really first rolled out by Rakuten in Japan in 2017. So we kind of missed the 5G wave. And so as new spectrum bands come online, we're able to build out using Open RAN. I would say other than Dish, who has deployed 20,000+, AT&T has made an investment of $14 billion in Open RAN. We're really focused internationally at this point. So more bands, more Open RAN. And as far as AI, it's been a great story for the telecommunications industry. We can use everything from management of spectrum, energy efficiency, and there's a lot of talk these days, as you can imagine, with concerns around drones. Can we do detection using AI?
Thank you for that. And this is a broader question, I think, for the panel, but it will just go down. What specific actions would you recommend for us as Congress to take? I mean, obviously, we've talked about some of the legal problems, some of the regulatory hurdles, some of the outdated regulations that may exist. What would you share with Congress about ways that we can modernize our system? We'll start with you, sir.
I think we all agree. I hope auction authority is where you start.
Correct.
And I would say make it permanent, provide the reliability that the FCC has the power to do it, and and then how that then impacts band planning in the future.
Auction authority, RNG, and then just working with our allies around the world to deploy safe and secure networks globally.
Same. Auction authority with a plan associated with it and permitting reform.
Permitting reform, okay.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. I think auction authority, improvement in the interagency coordination process with appropriate congressional oversight, and assistance to the administration on developing uniform and single voice policies when we appear at the next WARC in 2027.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from Ohio, Mr. Landsman, for 5 minutes to ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for this incredibly important hearing. The broadband Wi-Fi work that we do, probably one of the most important things we have to get right nationally, and obviously Congress has to play a big leadership role in that. And this has been, as one of my colleagues said, largely a bipartisan discussion because it is a bipartisan issue. I mean, there's two pieces that are really important that stand out for me. One is just the relevancy, the impact it has on our economy. I mean, growing economies are economies where there are massive investments in infrastructure and education, and broadband is obviously a huge piece of the infrastructure. And it's core to our global competitiveness. The second is just the impact it has on our daily lives, which Chairman Powell, you've talked a lot about. I represent Southwest Ohio. It's a city, suburbs, rural Ohio, and it is just one of the most important things that we do to make sure that everyone has access because of how important it is to their healthcare, to their education, to their connection to the world and to each other. Two big questions have emerged here from me. One has to do with reauthorization and how we divvy up the spectrum capacity, and the second has to do with what we do with that revenue. Right? Those are two big questions that I think we'll sort out in a bipartisan way. Let me start on the reauthorization question. Maybe each one of you could just talk a little bit about, if you had one big, I've heard a little bit from each of you about priorities, but one big priority, I'm new. So if there's one thing you want us to really nail as we work on reauthorization, what would it be?
For us, it's key when you go back each time Congress has done this, 1997, 2005, 2012, it's always been authority plus. Sometimes you direct specific auctions. Sometimes you say you need to auction a certain amount. But that particularly because the government controls so much of this, if you give the FCC, an independent agency, authority to auction without something to sell, it can be an empty tool.
Got it.
And so for us, it really is that connection.
I think the authority is important, but I'd slightly disagree with Mr. Gillen. The FCC, when it has plenary auction authority, it has the authority to find an auction spectrum without further direction from Congress. I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that you have to tell them what spectrum to authorize. They've been doing that for the better part of this century. So I think that's important. And I also think that if you entertain the idea of assigning specific spectrum bands, then you have to wrestle with the conflict we've spent all morning talking about. You've got to figure out how you're going to resolve the complexity of the Defense Department systems. That needs to be done by experts down at the agency.
So I would say that the NTIA administrator needs to be an undersecretary, and government titles matter, and it makes a huge difference. If you're the NTIA administrator, you're having to brief the deputy secretary to talk to an agency about an issue that they have know nothing about.
Mr. Lewis, thank you.
I agree with that. And with auction authority, I would say I'd agree with former chairman. You don't have to be prescriptive because there's not a lot of new spectrum bands out there. Letting Ms. Ronaldo's agency, the NTIA and the FCC do the studies that point to in the right direction is important, and preserving the balance of licensed, unlicensed, and sharing. Wi-Fi 7 is a great opportunity, but requires 360 megahertz of spectrum band. Yeah.
And then the second piece is on the revenue. It's obviously there's some consternation, some worry because of a document that came out that maybe these dollars could be used for pay-fors. And on the tax piece, I think there's bribe
broad support for tax relief for working folks, middle class, small businesses. It's the top 1% that I think folks like me struggle with. The revenue, assuming it stays here, and anyone, but Mr. Lewis, start with you. You mentioned a few big things. Again, if you had to pick one major investment, I'm assuming it's the expansion and then the inclusion, but I'm curious what piece, where do those dollars need to go?
I usually highlight too, definitely digital inclusion work on the ground needs long-term funding, as do other broadband, other.
That's really
funds.
just making sure that more people have it.
Yeah, addressing all three drivers of the digital divide, not just infrastructure, not just affordability, but adoption and helping people get it. But if I picked a second, NG 911, kudos to the chairman and former Congresswoman Eshoo for leading on the NG 911 bill last year.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. The chair now recognizes the representative from New Jersey, Mr. Kane. You're recognized for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses being here today. Mr. Powell and Mr. Gillen, my district boasts some of the most capable innovators in the world. It also has areas that still face gaps in connectivity. How can technologies using licensed and unlicensed spectrum both supercharge our existing industries and generate growth in more rural areas? Whichever one of you would like to go first.
Thank you for the question. Well, the power of wireless, particularly full power 5G wireless, gives you the opportunity to push out broadband to other places. So Rappahannock County, Virginia, rural Virginia, there's no terrestrial fiber cable services right now. Because of bid-ban auctions you've made possible, there is now 5G home service available. So roughly 20% of those new customers had never had broadband before, because that's an ability to scale and move quickly. So it's one of the places that you can push out beyond where we are today.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr.
I think
Powell?
one of the challenges in rural is always infrastructure. One of the challenges the wireless companies have is, in order to serve those communities effectively, you have to densify the network. You have to go out there and spend the money to put up towers to concentrate. That's expensive. It's a big capital expense for them, and so that's been slow. If you look at shared spectrum on CBRS, it covers 70% of all unserved rural areas. That's why you're seeing projects that allow communities to take matters into their own hands. And in your own state, CBR spectrum is being used at Newark International Airport without having to await the use from a commercial service.
Thank you. Ms. Ronaldo, can you speak to the effect that adoption of Open RAN technologies could have on our supply chain and strengthening American wireless competitiveness globally? And can you also provide an update on where the development and deployment of these technologies now stand?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest concerns is that we wake up one day and there's only one vendor for the entire world. So the concept of Open RAN, I believe, has been so successful because we've gone from a handful of vendors now to hundreds. A lot here in the United States, but also Japan, Taiwan, and Europe. So since we launched as a coalition, there are now over 100 global deployments. I mentioned TELUS earlier. TELUS, they're going to deploy by 100% by 2029. Viettel in Vietnam is deploying using Qualcomm and DeepSig to our PC members. Palau, a small island in the South Pacific, they just put out an RFP, and the number of proposals that they received were astonishing because the competitiveness of Open RAN does allow more vendors to participate in the market. So it's really a win-win.
Thank you. And then Mr. Powell and Mr. Gillen, can you both speak to how licensed and unlicensed spectrum are used in emergency response in cooperation with first responders, and what needs to be done to make sure that spectrum is used as effectively as possible to keep Americans safe in the event of an emergency or a disaster?
I think both are critical. I want to say that. I've been involved in these situations. I'll give you an example. Just in the LA fire situation, Charter was able to open 35,000 Wi-Fi hotspots immediately to try to improve communications when other infrastructure had been devastated. That's really important, to be able to use every technological resource to get a network up quickly in these communities, often ones that are suffering without power, as well as communications infrastructure.
Mr. Gillum?
I agree with the chair. This is a disaster. We all need to be working together. All these technologies can complement each other. In terms of wireless, we're proud that 80% of 911 calls are made on a smartphone today, and the amount that we've invested to make sure that that first responders can find you when you make that call with location accuracy, and the power of wireless emergency alerts to be an amplifier to voice. Mr. Lewis talked about how far we've come in that program. And then in terms of the disaster recovery themselves, the technologies that we're leveraging now, that there's cows and colts. We put cell phones on wheels, we put cell phones on trucks to go into an area to immediately have coverage, because it's so critical. You've lost everything, you need that connectivity. And so we take that responsibility very seriously. And the situation that, we can disagree on a lot of things when it comes to disaster relief. We all come together to serve customers.
Thank you to all of our witnesses, and I'll you back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. The chair now recognizes the representative from Indiana, Ms. Houchin, for 5 minutes to ask your question.
Thank you, Chairman Hudson and Ranking Member Matsui, and thanks to the witnesses for your testimony and for speaking with us today. I want to start my remarks first by saying how excited I am to be here as a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. This is my first hearing as a member of E&C, and I look forward to working on the issues under this committee's jurisdiction. Back home as a state senator, I worked on expanding broadband access, particularly in rural areas. I was proud to lead that fight, and it's a fight that I'm excited to continue at the federal level. I look forward to certainly working with each member of the committee, Mr. Chairman, on our shared priorities, and hope that we can find some common ground to bring real and positive results for the American people. And I'm glad we're starting this work, this Congress, on this issue of importance of both national security and global competitiveness, and that is spectrum. While we may not realize it, spectrum directly impacts the ways in which millions of Americans go about their daily lives, both at home and at work, from listening to the radio to watching television, to using cell phones and browsing the internet. Spectrum determines how these devices carry data. That said, it is a limited resource, and I recognize that the United States must play a leading role in innovation relative to spectrum to maintain our position as the world's leader in new technology. So my first question is for Mr. Gillen. My district in southern Indiana is largely rural, made up of small towns and cities, and I'm certainly proud of the work that we did in the state Senate to level the playing field for rural parts of the state. But the truth is we continue to lag behind the coasts and urban areas in access to the internet and the tools that spectrum can provide. How can your company's use of spectrum help with closing the digital divide for rural America?
Thank you for the question. NERA earlier today released a report that said for every 100 megahertz of new spectrum available, it can help create access for 275,000 households that don't have it today. And so with the opportunity, particularly with the 5G home product, to get to places that home broadband hasn't gotten to yet, that the benefit of that opportunity is we can see that happen in real time. Accenture says that we get to roughly 40% of houses without any help. And then the question is, where does the help come, whether it's the 5G fund at the FCC or the BEAD fund at NTIA? We're going to need government's help. But with spectrum, we can continually provide more and more coverage throughout your area.
Great. Mr. Powell, do you have anything in addition to that to add about how the company's use of spectrum can help close the digital divide?
Yes. As we talked about earlier, when you use some of the CBRS shared spectrum, you're allowed to let communities take matters into their own hands and build networks while they're awaiting commercial systems to come and densify their network. I also want to put a plug in, because it's equally in this committee's jurisdiction. It's getting the fixed infrastructure out there too. A lot of wireless needs fixed infrastructure in order to put those signals into the ground pretty quickly. So with the BEAD investments that we're making, and the companies that I represent are deepening their penetration in rural America, these things have to be seen as complements. One will not survive without the other.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit, my colleague from New Jersey talked about Open RAN, so I want to ask a few questions about that. I'm excited by the prospects there to potentially increase vendor diversity, both in the United States and with our trusted partners around the globe, to open the door for new entrants into radio access and to the network marketplace. So Ms. Ronaldo, how can O-RAN technology help us stay competitive with China?
So for so long, especially, I used to work for the House Intelligence Committee when they wrote the Wildware report, and then at NTIA, and it was the policy of the United States to go around the world and say, don't use Huawei, it's a security concern. Open RAN is the, if not them, then who? We give people something to run to as opposed to run away from. And I believe that's why it's been so incredibly successful. So as we 5G and as we look to 6G, it's software-defined networks and virtualization. I use an example about TELUS. TELUS is ripping and replacing right now, and an executive said they're going to move to Open RAN because he never wants to be in a position of vendor lock ever again. So we are bringing that national security, supplier diversity, as well as the opportunity that Open RAN can bring.
Well, that let's particularly to my next question, does the deployment of 5 to 6G help with deployment of Open RAN? I think the answer to that is yes. Are there any barriers that do stand in the way of deploying the networks currently? And when do you believe we might expect more widespread development?
Yeah, so the inability to auction new spectrum and make new spectrum bands available, that's going to impact deployment. As well as we look internationally, I think it's important that we use diplomacy as much as possible to ensure that we're getting a supplied telecommunications chain out there.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from Texas, Mr. Goldman. You're recognized for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. It's I had about 100 questions that have all been asked already. So, but I do appreciate y'all's time today and for being here today. I'll ask a couple of quick questions, and we'll move on to my colleague from North Dakota. This is both for Ms. Ronaldo and Mr. Powell. Ms. Ronaldo, if you'll go first. How can we protect important national security missions while also fostering innovation? And how do shared spectrum approaches help us avoid those national security risks while still helping us find new spectrum for commercial use?
Yeah, so there's currently an ongoing multi-stakeholder process that I'm participating in that brings the private sector as well as the public sector together. They're going to start classified sessions soon. And so I think, as been mentioned, you bring the engineers in the room and then we can get things moving a little faster. So how do we take the emotion, take the policy out of it, and get the engineers to pave the path forward?
Understood. Thank you. Mr. Powell?
I think the quick answer is coexistence. How do you allow people to live together and both be able to do and operate and provide the services that are critical, whether they're military, national security services, or commercial services? Many of the bands we've had in the past have pioneered approaches to sharing. There are a lot of bands, even in the CBRS band, we have protection of incumbent military systems, particularly naval, coastal systems, and it allows them to operate effectively while we're able to offer commercial service.
Great, thank you very much. And Mr. Gillen, your testimony notes that significant demand for wireless networks and more commercial licensed spectrum is necessary to keep pace with that demand. Can you explain how the various types of spectrum auctions the FCC has used over the last decade work and how those address the American consumer needs?
Absolutely. The FCC's auctioned both commercial spectrum and government spectrum over the last 10 years, particularly in the 3 gigahertz range. A lot of the spectrum we're talking about is mid-band spectrum today. We were able to work through a process with the military to auction 100 megahertz for $22 billion in 3.45, and then C-band was satellite spectrum that we were able to repurpose for 5G. And that is we've had 87% growth in our networks over the last 2 years. It was those spectrum bands that made it possible for us to have the capacity to meet that demand. And so when we look at what's coming next, it's how do we replicate the successes of those and where do we find that spectrum? And we think both of those bands adjacent to it, we can run that same playbook in an effective way.
Interesting. Thank you all again very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you. The representative yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from North Dakota, Ms. Fedorchak. You're recognized for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for organizing this great hearing today. As a representative from North Dakota, I'm big into natural resources and resources. And spectrum is a very important national resource. So I appreciate the opportunity this hearing has to talk about how to best manage this resource for the benefit of American citizens. I'll have to say that, to the extent that managing this resource results in additional funding for the federal government,
I'm really confident that my House colleagues, especially in this committee and on the Republican side of things, are committed to putting any additional revenues that might be generated from the sale of those to the benefit of everyday Americans, the farmers, the ranchers, the coal miners, oil field workers, teachers, nurses, those folks from North Dakota and throughout the country who are hard at work. I know that we will be very diligent to use those resources appropriately. So for all of you, thank you for your time. You've been sitting here a long time now. Probably are thinking about lunch and bathrooms and other things. So I promise I just have 2 questions, but your expertise is really vital to helping us make the best decision on how to use these resources. So quickly, I wanted to ask Mr. Gillen, help me understand the need for the dedicated spectrum and what sort of uses you use in that space that can't be done in the open, the unlicensed spectrum, and what the interference is that is created in the unlicensed that causes problems for you.
Thank you for the question. I think when we pick up our phones, we want that reliability. And what interference protection gives you is the security that you know that we're going to build out that spectrum, $30 billion last year. We know that we control that spectrum and that our neighbors or others can't use that same spectrum. And so the certainty and reliability that you rely on every day comes from that licensed spectrum. And I think a lot of the conversation today, all spectrum is shared at some core. There is no cleared spectrum really. It's just a matter of what different tools of shared spectrum you're using and whether or not government has preemptible rights, whether or not you have full power ability to do it. So for a lot of these conversations, it's how do we work around the government, how do we work with systems to make sure that it's something that works for us to be able to compete against China, but also safeguard incumbent users as well.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And then the second question is to both you and Mr. Powell. If you were designing the proper mix between licensed and unlicensed, how would you do that? How would you separate it out?
For my mind, as a former policymaker, I would evaluate the demand uses that American citizens make of the spectrum. It's not a simple matter of comparing who has how many megahertz versus who else has how many megahertz. You have to assign weights to that. You know, if 60% of all data is going over unlicensed networks and Wi-Fi, if 80 to 90% of that cell phone's data is going over Wi-Fi, then it's a false equivalency to say they have exactly the same amount. You need to allocate more toward the highest and greatest demands. Now, I think there's just since I'm not misunderstood, there is a place for exclusive licensing and high-powered spectrum. It's about getting that right. But I think that we have underappreciated the significant uses that Americans make. And I would focus more on how to find shared solutions.
You'll be surprised to know I have a slightly different take. So for our perspective,
Really?
we absolutely need both. And we lead the world today in wireless Wi-Fi access. And I think we need to get back to there on 5G. And so I think in our minds, you look at where data growth is on our networks, what the congestion is. I think the congestion and how much actual capacity challenges should dictate a lot of this conversation. I think absolutely we use Wi-Fi a lot on this device because when we're at home, we love these devices. You're not plugging into a desktop. So a lot of these statistics matter, you know, when you're out of your house, it's not on Wi-Fi, you're on this, and we need both of them to work. So I think we need to work towards a policy that we're the best at both of these things.
Awesome. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding back. And I want to welcome Representative Miller Meeks from Iowa to the subcommittee. And you are going to bring us home here. I'll recognize you for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Hudson. It's wonderful to be back on this committee, and Ranking Member Matsui as well for allowing me to wave one to this critically important hearing today. Critically important because, as the chairman said, I'm from Iowa, and I also happen to be a military veteran. So both from the national security and the connectivity viewpoint, this is an important hearing today. And I also want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the subcommittee. You've been here a long time, so I'll try to be brief. I'm just going to make a mention of something Mr. Gillum just said. We don't want you to work around the government. That has a different context when we say that. We want you to work with the government because we know that the DoD needs access to this spectrum and they may need to preempt other uses. In Iowa, our farmers depend on the latest technology to make their operations more efficient. Think precision ag, and I think you mentioned that, Mr. Powell. Our schools, our healthcare facilities rely on strong connectivity for educational tools and telemedicine, and businesses across the state need access to cutting-edge communication system to remain competitive in the global market. When as a state senator in Iowa, I passed broadband bills, I said, I lovingly named these, please get Dr. Miller Meeks better internet connection so her children will come home for more than a day. That's how bad it was. And I cannot tell you how many Wi-Fi providers I switched, or satellite providers. Spectrum, which makes all of this possible, is a finite resource that must be responsibly managed. Mr. Powell, in your testimony, you point out that the U.S. could potentially fall behind in 5G and 6G deployment. And when I've traveled overseas, I would echo that sentiment. Without embracing shared spectrum policies, what safeguards do you propose to ensure that critical national security infrastructure and government operations are not jeopardized in the process?
Yeah, I think the whole predicate why we're champions of this spectrum policy approach is that it fundamentally presumes that we'll work together and share with those systems as opposed to displace them or minimize them. That doesn't mean that's always possible, but we think that's the going in effective approach when we know both have equally compelling uses. You should try to figure out if there's a way for them to coexist first.
Mr. Gillum, you noted that 5G is helping to create high-paying jobs and economic opportunities in manufacturing and agriculture. And as an advocate for U.S. industry, as we both are, can you explain how 5G is specifically contributing to the growth of these sectors you might have in your posters, particularly in the context of rural economies like Iowa's, and what additional spectrum could do to accelerate these benefits?
Absolutely. On the first piece, I think manufacturing is one of the places that we really feel opportunity. How do you bring manufacturing back? And you look at Ericsson has a plant in Texas that's 120% employee productivity improvement. So it's one of those opportunities that it's a roadmap for how we can do this. In terms of in rural, it really is a matter of the 5G home product is beginning to make a dent to the challenges that you face to the state legislature, and that the more spectrum gives us the ability. It's a capacity-starved service, and so you need and have like more capacity. Let's just do it more people. So one provider has 1 million people on a waiting list right now. We can make those subscribers with more spectrum.
Ms. Rinaldo, in your testimony, you mentioned the PRC's aggressive efforts to dominate wireless technologies and markets through state-sponsored corporate theft and market manipulation. How do you propose the U.S. respond to these efforts, and what role can American companies and policymakers play in countering this state-driven competition?
Help support vendor diversity and work with our partners around the world to do the same.
And given the ongoing cybersecurity threats from adversaries such as the PRC, what specific policies or investments would you recommend to enhance the security and resilience of U.S. wireless networks, particularly in protecting our vital communications infrastructure?
So Congress needs to reauthorize the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, which allows information sharing. It needs teeth.
I was plugging that for you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank the representative for yielding back. Seeing that there are no further members wishing to be recognized, I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today and staying for over 3 hours. Ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing document list. Without objection, so ordered. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on Wednesday, February 6th. Without objection, subcommittee is adjourned.
All right, everybody, we go from one to the next. So hope all of you are having fun. I do have a VA one that you guys are going to hopefully enjoy. And that is on this channel on all of them. So I will see you guys later. Hope you have a wonderful day and be good to one another because we are in this together, no matter if you're left, right, or center. See you guys on the next one.